1989. Hilarious history to fall asleep. Irony, Sledgehammers, and Glass-Bottomed Boats by Mark Twain. Copyright 2026. James Henderson. Chapter 1. The Estate Sale of the Old Guard. It has often been said that history is merely a collection of jokes played upon the dead by the living, but in the year of our Lord 1989, the dead seem to be having the last laugh. I have spent a fair amount of time observing the human race, mostly from the safe, dry vantage point of a riverbank or a lecture podium, and I have concluded that humanity's greatest talent is its ability to walk backward into the future while claiming to be leading a parade. By the time January of 1989 rolled around, the world was suffering from a collective case of era fatigue. The 19th century, that soot-stained, steam-powered behemoth of my own youth, had been trying to leave the party for nearly 90 years, but it kept finding someone else to talk to by the coat rack. In 1989, however, the heavyweights of the old world finally decided to vacate the premises, and they didn't just leave. They handed over the keys to a generation that hadn't yet decided whether to drive the car or simply dismantle it for the copper wiring. The passing of the living God. The year began with the departure of Emperor Hirohito of Japan. Now, there was a man who understood the longevity of a brand. He had reigned for 62 years, a tenure that makes the average American presidency look like a weekend layover in a cheap motel. When he ascended the chrysanthemum throne, the world was still largely fueled by coal and horses. By the time he left it, Japan was producing pocket-sized televisions and cars that could outrun a rumor. Hirohito was the last of the living gods, a job title that, while prestigious, carries an enormous amount of paperwork and a distressing lack of privacy. Imagine being told you are divine, only to realize that divinity apparently requires you to sit through endless bureaucratic meetings about rice yields and naval tonnage. To the Japanese people, he was the Showa emperor, a symbol of a nation that had risen from the ashes of a disastrous war to become a neon-drenched titan of commerce. To me, he represented the final snapping of the thread that tied the world to the age of absolute monarchs. When he died, it wasn't just a man passing, it was the formal resignation of the concept of grandeur. The world he left behind was no longer interested in emperors who sat in silent stone palaces. It was interested in pop stars who wore too much lace and talked about their feelings on cable television. The 19th century gave us the great man theory of history. 1989 gave us the great brand theory. The surrealists' final melting. Hardly had the incense from the emperor's funeral cleared when Salvador Dalí decided to make his exit. If Hirohito was the stoic anchor of the old world, Dalí was its flamboyant, wax-mustachioed runaway kite. Dalí was a man who spent his life proving that reality is merely a suggestion that one is free to ignore if one has enough paint and a sufficiently eccentric wardrobe. I have seen many strange things in my time. Mississippi riverboat pilots who could navigate by the smell of a mudflat, and politicians who occasionally told the truth. But Dalí's brand of madness was something entirely more professional. He didn't just see melting clocks, he marketed them. He died in Figueres, Spain, listening to his favorite record, Tristan and Isolde. It is a fitting end for a man who lived as if his entire existence were a stage play where the director had gone missing and the lead actor had decided to improvise with a live lobster. Dali's passing marked the end of the great eccentrics. In my day, a man became an eccentric by living in a barrel or refusing to wear pants in public. In Dali's day, it was an art form. He turned the bizarre into a commodity, proving that if you hold a pose long enough, the world will eventually stop laughing and start writing checks. With Dali gone, the world felt a little more linear, a little more beige. We were losing the men who knew how to wear a cape without irony. The keys to the purgatory. With the living God and the surrealist king out of the way, the world of 1989 found itself in a peculiar state of vacuum. It was the ghost of the 19th century finally handing over the ledger. I looked around at the heirs of this estate and felt a twinge of parental concern. The youth of 1989 were a strange lot. They wore denim jackets that were 3 sizes too large, hair that appeared to have been styled by a localized electrical storm, and shoes that pumped up with air for reasons that science has yet to adequately explain. They were the first generation to grow up entirely in the glow of the cathode ray tube, a device that I suspect does for the mind what a sledgehammer does to a grandfather clock. The transition was palpable. The old world was built on iron, steam, and the slow, agonizing crawl of the handwritten letter. It was a world where a man's reputation was his bond, and a web was something you swept out of the corner of the barn with a broom. The new world, the one being born in the delivery room of 1989, was built on silicon, plastic, and the terrifying speed of the bite. In the old days, if you wanted to insult a man, you had to walk to his house or wait 3 weeks for the mail to deliver your grievance. In 1989, humanity was beginning to realize it could insult a total stranger 3,000 miles away almost instantaneously. We were trading the dignity of the horse-drawn carriage for the frantic convenience of the microwave oven. The Great American Estate Sale. I often wonder what the Founding Fathers would have made of 1989. I suspect Jefferson would have been fascinated by the technology and horrified by the polyester, while Washington would have looked at a Walkman and wondered why everyone was walking around with their heads in a vice. There is a certain irony in the fact that as the great empires of the East were beginning to crumble, a topic we shall get to when the Sledgehammers start swinging in November, the great empire of the West was distracting itself with a Batman movie and a Game Boy. We were witnessing the greatest geopolitical shift in 100 years, and half the population was worried about whether or not their leg warmers matched their scrunchies. This is the central joke of 1989. The world was being handed the most powerful tools in human history. The ability to connect every mind on the planet, the ability to peer into the furthest reaches of the galaxy, the ability to collapse walls with a single broadcast, and we weren't entirely sure if we wanted to use them to promote liberty or to sell more carbonated sugar water. The 19th century left the premises all right. It took the velvet curtains, the quill pens, and the sense of slow-motion dignity with it. It left us with the keys to a high-speed, neon-lit, digital future. And it didn't leave an instruction manual. We were standing in the driveway looking at the car, wondering where the on switch was and if the information superhighway had any decent places to stop for a sandwich. It was the end of the beginning, or perhaps the beginning of the end. Either way, the ghost of the 19th century wasn't coming back. It had seen enough. It had seen the emperor die and the surrealist melt, and it decided that the 20th century was perfectly capable of making its own mess from here on out. And what a magnificent, hilarious, heartbreaking mess it promised to be. Chapter 2. The Universal Spiderweb. I have always harbored a deep-seated suspicion of anything that promises to manage information. In my experience, information is much like a panicked herd of mules. The moment you think you have it fenced in, it finds a hole in the perimeter and trampled your vegetable garden. So, when a polite young Englishman named Tim Berners-Lee, working at a laboratory in Switzerland called CERN, sat down in March of 1989 to pen a proposal titled Information Management, a Proposal, the world should have checked its pockets and looked for the nearest exit. Now, CERN is a place where they spend billions of dollars to smash atoms together at terrifying speeds, simply to see what's inside. It is essentially the scientific equivalent of a small boy taking a sledgehammer to his father's gold watch to see what makes it tick, only with more PhDs and a considerably larger electricity bill. But while the physicists were busy hunting for subatomic particles that vanish the moment you look at them, Mr. Berners-Lee was busy inventing a way for the entire human race to share its every fleeting thought, grievance, and cat picture with a speed that would make a lightning bolt look like a Sunday stroll. He called it the World Wide Web. I call it the Universal Spiderweb, and we are the flies, happily buzzing into the silk because we've been told it's a shortcut to the honey. The ghost of the telegraph. In my day, we thought the telegraph was the pinnacle of human achievement. It was a miracle of copper and clicks. It allowed a man at New York to tell a man in San Francisco that he was an idiot in under an hour. We thought, in our 19th century innocence, that speed of communication would lead to a brotherhood of man. We figured that if we could talk to each other faster, we would understand each other better. We were, of course, catastrophically wrong. Fast forward to 1989. Mr. Berners-Lee looked at the scattered computers of the world, those beige humming boxes that look like high-tech bread bins, and realized they were all lonely. They were islands of data in a vast, silent sea. He proposed a system of hypertext, which is a fancy way of saying that one document could have a link to another. You click a word and poof, you're transported to another page. It sounds innocent enough. It sounds helpful. But as a man who has spent a fair amount of time navigating the Mississippi, I know a shortcut is often just a way to get stranded on a sandbar in record time. This web was designed to link the world's knowledge, but I suspect its true purpose, discovered by the rest of humanity within 15 minutes of its launch, was to link the world's nonsense. The speed of the lie. I have famously observed that a lie can travel halfway around the world while the truth is putting on its boots. In 1989, the truth was still fumbling with its laces, but the lie had just discovered blast processing and a global distribution network. The brilliance of the web is that it removes the gatekeepers. In the old world, if you wanted to publish your theory that the moon is made of green cheese and the president is actually a sentient head of cabbage, you had to find a printer willing to waste ink on you, and then you had to find a bookstore willing to stock your drivel. There were layers of common sense between your madness and the public's eyes. But the web? The web is a printing press that everyone owns and no one edits. It is a global gossip parlor where every village idiot is given a megaphone and a platform. Mr. Berners-Lee envisioned a grand library of Alexandria, accessible from a desk in your pajamas. What he didn't account for was that most people, given the choice between reading the collected works of Voltaire or reading a 3-sentence rumor about their neighbor's infidelity, will choose the neighbor every single time. The geometry of the link. The most insidious part of this hypertext is the link. It is a digital rabbit hole. In a book, you start at the beginning, you go to the middle, and you reach the end. It is a disciplined, linear journey. It requires a certain amount of stamina and a respect for the author's intent. The web, however, is a labyrinth designed by a spider on stimulants. You start by looking up the history of the steam engine, and 3 links later, you are reading about the secret life of the common garden slug. And an hour after that, you are embroiled in a heated debate about whether a hot dog is a sandwich. You haven't learned anything about steam engines, but your brain is now full of digital lint. We are trading the deep well of knowledge for a vast puddle. It is a mile wide and an inch deep, and we are all splashing around in it, convinced we are swimming in the ocean. I've seen this before. It's the same impulse that drove the gold rush. The idea that you can get something for nothing, that wisdom can be acquired without the labor of thought, simply by clicking a glowing button. The great digital leveling. There is a certain irony in 1989 being the year of the web's birth. This was the year the Berlin Wall was crumbling, a physical barrier being torn down by the hands of the people. And yet, at the very same moment, we were building a new wall, a wall made of code and silicon. The web promised to democratize information, and it did. It gave the pauper the same access to data as the prince, but it also gave the fool the same credibility as the philosopher. In the digital town square, the man who spent 40 years studying the stars is frequently shouted down by the man who spent 40 minutes looking at a blurry photograph of a weather balloon. I worry for the future of the truth. When everything is linked, nothing is anchored. When you can find evidence for any delusion you care to harbor simply by typing it into a search box, the very concept of a fact begins to melt like one of Dali's clocks. We are entering an era where the loudest voice wins, and the web provides a very, very loud voice to anyone with a keyboard and a grudge. The spider's invitation. And so the information management proposal was accepted. The first web server was set up at CERN, and the first URL was minted. Mr. Berners-Lee, to his immense credit, refused to patent his invention. He gave it to the world for free. It was a noble gesture, a gift of Prometheus. But as we know from the classics, when you give fire to humans, the first thing they do is burn down the neighbor's fence. As I watch the people of 1989 begin to stumble into this digital frontier, I see a familiar glint in their eyes. It's the look of a man who thinks he's found a shortcut to paradise. They see the web and think of connectivity, brotherhood, and the end of ignorance. They don't see the spider. They don't see that once you're in the web, you're no longer the navigator. You are the data. You are the product. You are the fly being wrapped in silk, while the machine decides which part of you to digest first. I suppose it's inevitable. Humanity has always been obsessed with its toys. We spent the 19th century building bigger engines to move our bodies. We are going to spend the 20th and 21st centuries building bigger engines to move our opinions. I just hope that among all the links and hypertext and global gossip, we don't lose the ability to sit quietly in a room and think a single, solitary, unlinked thought. But then again, who has time for thinking when there's a new information management system to explore? I'm told there's a page about a dancing hamster that is simply delightful. Onward, into the silk. Chapter 3. The Black Tide of Alaska. There is something about a body of water that demands a man's undivided attention, a fact I learned while navigating the shifting sandbars and treacherous snags of the Mississippi. To a pilot, the water is not merely a resource or a scenic backdrop, it is a living, breathing entity with a temperament that can change from a playful kitten to a vengeful god in the time it takes to light a cigar. If you disrespect the river will eventually find a way to deposit you and your dignity onto a muddy bank. But the Mississippi, for all its muddy complexity, is a puddle compared to the Prince William Sound in Alaska, and the steamboats I piloted, magnificent puffing wedding cakes of wood and iron, were mere toys compared to the Exxon Valdez. In March of 1989, this steel leviathan, carrying enough oil to lubricate the hinges of the entire solar system, decided to take a shortcut through a reef. The result was a calamity of such breathtaking proportions that it made the average shipwreck look like a spilled glass of milk at a Sunday school picnic. It was a moment that proved once and for all that while we have built machines of terrifying power, we are still operating them with the same fallible, distracted, and occasionally thirsty brains that we used back when we were throwing rocks at mammoths. The pilot who wasn't there. Now, as a former pilot, I have a certain professional interest in who is standing at the wheel. In my day, if a pilot left the bridge while the boat was in motion, he usually had a very good reason, such as the boat being on fire or the sudden appearance of a rival captain with a shotgun. Captain Joseph Hazelwood, however, decided that the middle of a delicate navigational maneuver through ice-strewn waters was the perfect time to go below deck and rest. I have rested in my time, usually with a glass of something medicinal and a comfortable chair, but I generally waited until the boat was tied to a sturdy pier. To leave the bridge of a 987-foot tanker in the hands of a third mate who was likely as exhausted as a one-legged man in an upholstery-kicking contest is not management. It is an invitation to the universe to play a very dark joke on you. The Valdez struck Bly Reef with the dull, grinding thud of a billion-dollar mistake. It didn't just leak, it hemorrhaged. 11 million gallons of North Slope crude oil poured into the pristine, icy waters of Alaska. To give you a sense of scale, 11 million gallons is enough to fill 17 Olympic-sized swimming pools, or, if you prefer my measurements, enough to ruin the fishing prospects of 1,000 miles of coastline for the next century. The alchemy of sludge. The immediate reaction of the Exxon Corporation was a master class in the art of the corporate stutter. They spent the first few days blinking in the sunlight, wondering if perhaps the oil would simply realize it wasn't wanted and go back into the ship of its own accord. When it became clear that the oil had no such intentions and was, in fact, busy turning sea otters into black, sticky statues, the cleanup began. I have seen some futile efforts in my life. I once saw a man try to argue a mule out of a sinkhole using nothing but logic and a pamphlet on animal husbandry, but the cleanup of the Exxon Valdez spill was in a league of its own. The strategy seemed to involve sending thousands of people in yellow slickers onto the beaches to scrub individual rocks with hot water and paper towels. It was like trying to dry the Atlantic Ocean with a single pocket handkerchief. They used dispersants, which is a fancy word for soaps that make the oil disappear from the surface by sinking it to the bottom, where the fish can enjoy it in private. It was the architectural equivalent of cleaning your house by sweeping the dirt under the rug and then setting the rug on fire. The cost was astronomical. Exxon spent billions of dollars proving that while they couldn't find a way to keep the oil in the ship, they had no trouble finding the bottom of their bank account. It was a fascinating display of human industry. We spent 40 years developing the technology to suck the oil out of the ground, 3 days spilling it, and the next 3 decades trying to figure out how to unspill it. The mechanical heart and the human hand. This is the great irony of the late 20th century. We have surrounded ourselves with fail-safe systems, computer-guided navigation, and hulls of reinforced steel. We have built machines that are so complex they seem to possess a soul. But that soul is a hollow one. The mechanical heart of the Exxon Valdez didn't care about the whales, or the pristine Alaskan wilderness, or the livelihoods of the fishermen. It only cared about gravity and the path of least resistance. We have reached a point where our tools have outgrown our wisdom. We are like children playing with loaded cannons in a glass house. We tell ourselves that because the machine is advanced, we are safe. We trust the autopilot, forgetting that the autopilot doesn't have a conscience, doesn't feel regret, and won't have to look a blackened cormorant in the eye. As a pilot, I knew that the safety of the boat rested on one thing: the man at the wheel. Not his instruments, not his charts, and certainly not his corporate backing. It was his eyes, his judgment, and his respect for the water. When you remove the human element, or when the human element decides to go below for a nap, the machine becomes a monster. The PR tide. Then came the lawyers and the public relations experts. The PR experts. These are the men who can look at a burning orphanage and tell you it's actually a bold new initiative in urban heating. Exxon took out full-page advertisements in newspapers across the country, expressing their deep regret. Regret is a wonderful thing. It's cheap, it's easy to manufacture, and it doesn't require a bucket or a mop. They talked about their commitment to the environment with the same sincerity a fox might use when discussing his commitment to the safety of the hen house. The legal battles dragged on for years, a slow-motion circus of appeals and counter-appeals. In the end, the fines were reduced, the headlines faded, and the public moved on to the next disaster. But the water remembers. If you go to those beaches today and dig a few inches into the sand, you can still find the black tide of 1989. It is a permanent signature, a reminder that man's mistakes are written in ink that never truly dries. A pilot's final word. I sat on my porch, or the digital equivalent of one, and watched the footage of the Valdez. I saw the black ribbons of oil choking the life out of the Sound, and I felt a familiar pang in my chest. It wasn't just the environmental destruction, it was the sheer avoidable stupidity of it. In the 19th century, We were honest about our incompetence. If a boiler blew up on a steamboat, we knew it was because someone had tied down the safety valve or used substandard iron. We didn't have a PR firm to tell us it was a spontaneous thermal reorganization. We buried the dead, fixed the boat, and tried to be less stupid the next time. In 1989, we had reached a level of sophistication where we could be incompetent on a global scale and then use information management to make it look like a heroic effort. We have traded the pilot's responsibility for the corporation's liability. The Exxon Valdez was more than a shipwreck. It was a mirror. It showed us that no matter how many satellites we put in the sky, or how many universal spiderwebs we weave, we are still just passengers on a very small, very wet rock. And if we don't start paying attention to the man at the wheel and ensuring he stays on the bridge, we are going to find ourselves permanently aground on a reef of our own making. I suspect the sea otters would agree with me, though they are currently too busy trying to wash the commitment to the environment out of their fur to say so. Chapter 4. The Pocket-Sized Frontier. In my youth, if a man wanted to find an adventure, he had to physically go out and locate it. This usually involved a great deal of dust, a suspicious amount of manual labor, and the distinct possibility of being bitten by something that didn't have a name yet. An adventure was a three-dimensional affair that took place under the scorching sun or the pouring rain. You couldn't tuck it into your waistcoat and take it out during a dull sermon. But in April of 1989, a company in Japan called Nintendo, a name that sounds like a brand of expensive tea but actually refers to a group of people who have mastered the art of enchanting children, released a device called the Game Boy. It was a small gray plastic brick about the size of a sturdy ham sandwich, and it promised to move the frontier from the vast rolling plains of the West into the palm of a person's hand. I have spent many hours observing this phenomenon, and I have concluded that the human race has finally achieved its ultimate goal, the ability to be completely and utterly bored by reality while being violently entertained by 4 shades of greenish-gray, the gray shingle of destiny. The Game Boy was not what one would call a beauty. It had the aesthetic charm of a piece of government-issued stationery. It featured a screen the size of a postage stamp that displayed images in a color palette I can only describe as split pea soup left out in the sun. If you didn't have a light source directly over your shoulder, preferably a sun that was having an exceptionally bright day, you might as well have been staring into a coal cellar at midnight. And yet, I watched grown men who should have been worrying about the interest rates or the crumbling of the Soviet Union, hunch over this little plastic shingle as if it contained the secret to eternal life. It was the birth of the digital hunch. Before 1989, people on buses or trains looked out the window. They observed the passing scenery, they made eye contact with their neighbors, and they occasionally engaged in the ancient and honorable art of staring into space and wondering where it all went wrong. After the Game Boy arrived, the windows were forgotten. The horizon was replaced by a small, flickering screen, and the only thing people cared about was whether or not they could fit a long, skinny block into a hole before the music reached a frantic, anxiety-inducing crescendo. The tyranny of the falling brick. The primary weapon in this assault on the human attention span was a game called Tetris. It is a game of Russian origin, which I find deliciously ironic. While the Kremlin was busy trying to figure out how to keep the Soviet Union from falling apart, one of their engineers, a fellow named Alexei Pajitnov, had invented a way to make the entire Western world obsessed with falling bricks. The premise of Tetris is simple, which is why it is so insidious. Geometric shapes fall from the top of the screen, and you must rotate them to form solid lines. When a line is completed, it vanishes. It is the only job in the world where the more successful you are, the less you have to show for it. If you are a carpenter and you build a wall, you have a wall. If you are a Tetris player and you build a wall, the wall disappears, and the reward is that the next wall falls even faster. It is a metaphor for life, I suppose. We spend our days frantically trying to organize the chaos falling on our heads, hoping to clear enough space to survive the next 5 minutes, only to realize that the speed level has just increased, and we've run out of AA batteries. I watched a young lad play this game for 3 hours straight. He was so focused that I believe I could have set his hat on fire without him noticing. Every time a long piece appeared, that elusive 4-block vertical savior, his eyes would light up with a fervor I haven't seen since the great revival of 1844. It is a strange thing to see the human soul captivated by the geometry of a falling rectangle. The battery eater. Of course, the frontier of the Game Boy required fuel. In the 19th century, our frontiers were fueled by whiskey, hardtack, and the occasional stubborn mule. The Game Boy was fueled by AA batteries, a commodity that suddenly became more valuable than gold. The device was a glutton. It would devour 4 batteries in a matter of hours, leaving the screen to fade into a ghostly, illegible shimmer just as you were about to beat your high score. I suspect the battery manufacturers were the silent partners in this Nintendo conspiracy. They created a generation of battery scavengers, children who would go through every drawer in the house, disemboweling television remotes and flashlights just to get another 20 minutes of Tetris. I saw one father, a man of considerable dignity, reduced to tears because his son had borrowed the batteries from his electric razor. There is no fury like a man who has to go to a business meeting with half a beard because his offspring needed to see a pixelated Mario catch a fish. The portability of loneliness. There is a deeper shift at play here, one that my mechanical heart finds a bit melancholy. By making adventure portable, we have made it solitary. In my day, if you played a game, you played it with people. You sat around a table for poker, or you stood in a field for baseball. You had to look at your opponent, smell their cigar smoke, and judge whether they were bluffing or simply had a bad case of indigestion. There was a social contract. The Game Boy changed the contract. It allowed you to be somewhere else while sitting right next to someone. It was the first step toward the modern era, where we are all connected to the world but can't remember the name of the person sitting across from us at dinner. I call it the Great Indoor Migration. We stopped exploring the world and started exploring the level. I've seen people walking down the street, bumping into lampposts and tripping over small dogs, all because they were trying to navigate a digital dungeon. We are becoming a race of people with very strong thumbs and very bruised shins. The toy that conquered the world. Despite my grumbling, I cannot deny the genius of it. The Game Boy was the first piece of technology that felt like a companion. It didn't require a desk or a wall outlet. It was a piece of the future that you could drop in the mud, spill juice on, and still use to kill a rainy afternoon. It proved that humans don't actually need high definition or virtual reality to be happy. We just need a challenge that is slightly harder than our current skill level and a way to track our progress. Give a man a way to earn points, and he will ignore a revolution, a shipwreck, or a direct summons from the tax collector. As I look back at 1989, I see the Game Boy as the silent victor of the decade. While the politicians were talking about new world orders, the children, and an alarming number of adults, were quietly being rewired. We were learning to find our satisfaction in the palm of our hand. We were preparing for a world where being lost was no longer a physical state, but a matter of your screen turning off. I reckon that if we ever do go to Mars, the first man off the ship won't be looking for water or signs of life. He'll be sitting on a red rock, hunched over, trying to find a spare set of batteries so he can finally finish level 20. The frontier has been tamed, mapped, and reduced to a 2-inch screen. And the Lord help us, we've never been more entertained. Chapter 5. The Courage of a Single Shadow. If you have ever attempted to argue with a mule that has decided it is no longer interested in the forward movement of a plow, you have a rudimentary understanding of the situation in Tiananmen Square in the spring of 1989. However, instead of one stubborn mule, there were 1 million students, and instead of a plow, they were refusing to move the entire machinery of the Chinese state. I have long observed that authority is a very fragile glass ornament. It looks imposing on the shelf, and it glitters with the reflected light of its own self-importance. But it only takes one well-aimed pebble, or in this case, a few thousand hunger strikers, to show that the whole thing is held together by little more than habit and a very loud megaphone. The great gathering of discontent. Beijing in May was a spectacular mess. Imagine, if you will, a square large enough to hold the population of a mid-sized kingdom, filled to the gills with idealistic youth who had decided that democracy sounded like a much more interesting hobby than state-mandated silence. They built a statue they called the Goddess of Democracy. She looked a bit like our own Lady Liberty, though she appeared to have been constructed in a hurry out of plaster and foam, looking like a cousin who had been invited to a party but hadn't had time to finish her makeup. To the aging leaders in the Kremlin, excuse me, the Forbidden City, one old fortress looks much like another when you're in the business of repression. This statue was an insult. It was a physical manifestation of a plot twist they hadn't written. The leaders of China were men of a certain vintage, men who had survived revolutions, long marches, and several decades of being told they were the smartest people in the room. To them, 1 million students asking for a seat at the table wasn't political engagement. It was a personal affront to their dignity. It was as if the wallpaper had suddenly decided to tell the homeowner how to arrange the furniture. The indifference of steel. By June, the patience of the old men had evaporated, and they decided to use the only tool that a bureaucracy truly understands: overwhelming, clanking, indifferent force. They sent in the tanks. Now, a tank is a marvelous piece of engineering if your goal is to be entirely unsociable. It is a house made of iron that carries its own cannon and has the conversational charm of a landslide. On the night of June 3rd and the morning of June 4th, the People's Army entered the square to remind the people that the people is a term that only the government is allowed to define. It was a dark, bloody business, the kind that makes a man want to retire to a cave and stop checking the newspapers. But amidst the tragedy, the year 1989 produced a moment of such exquisite singular defiance that it almost redeemed the species. The man with the shopping bags. On June 5th, a column of Type 59 tanks was rumbling down Chang'an Avenue, the Avenue of Eternal Peace. It's a lovely name for a street, provided you don't mind the irony of it being currently occupied by vehicles designed for eternal war. Suddenly, out from the side of the road, stepped a man. He was not wearing armor. He was not carrying a sword. He was a man in a white shirt and dark trousers, and this is the detail that delights my soul. He was carrying 2 shopping bags. He looked less like a revolutionary and more like a man who had just realized he forgot to buy eggs and was taking a shortcut home. He walked into the middle of the street and simply stopped. The lead tank halted. It tried to go around him. The man stepped to the left. The tank tried to go to the right. The man stepped to the right. It was a bizarre, silent dance between a 50-ton engine of destruction and a pedestrian with a light lunch. I have seen many brave things in my life. I have seen pilots stay at the wheel of a burning ship, and I have seen soldiers charge into the face of a battery of Parrott guns. But there is something uniquely TwAInian about a man stopping a column of tanks with nothing but his grocery bags and a bellyful of absolute, unwavering conviction. The audacity of the pedestrian. What was he thinking? I suspect he wasn't thinking about history with a capital H. A man who thinks about history usually poses for a portrait or looks for a flag to wave. This man looked like he was simply annoyed. He had the posture of a man who is saying, "I am walking here, and you are in my way, and I don't care if you have a cannon, I have a receipt for these groceries." For a few minutes, the entire power of the Chinese state was held in check by a man who appeared to be on his way to a quiet afternoon of reading. The tanks, those symbols of absolute authority, looked utterly ridiculous. They looked like giant metallic bullies who had been told no by a kindergarten teacher and didn't know how to handle the rejection. Eventually, the man was pulled away by bystanders. Some say they were worried citizens. Others say they were security forces in plain clothes. And he vanished into the fog of the century. We don't know his name. We don't know what was in the bags. But he had already done the impossible. He had shown that steel is only as powerful as the fear it can inspire. And for those few minutes on Chang'an Avenue, the fear was gone. The bureaucratic aftermath. The Chinese government, in a display of information management that would have made even the most cynical 19th century politician blush, later claimed that the event didn't happen, or if it did, it was a counter-revolutionary riot orchestrated by foreign agents who were apparently very good at providing shopping bags. They tried to scrub the square, they washed away the blood and the plaster of the goddess, and they told the world that order had been restored. But you cannot wash away a photograph that has been burned into the retina of the world. The tank man proved a point that I have tried to make for years. The individual is the only thing that actually exists. Governments, armies, and empires are merely ideas. that we all agree to believe in for a while. But a man standing in the street with his groceries, that is a fact. The lesson for the living. As 1989 rolled on, the image of that lone shadow against the iron giants traveled the globe via the universal spider web we discussed in the last chapter. It became a beacon for every other person living under a wall or a curtain. It taught the world that you don't need a tank to fight a tank. You just need to be more stubborn than the machine. You need to realize that the person inside the tank is also a man, and he is currently wondering why he is being outmaneuvered by a fellow in a white shirt. The tragedy of Tiananmen was a dark chapter, certainly, but the tank man was the margin note that changed the meaning of the whole book. He showed us that while power grows out of the barrel of a gun, it can be brought to a screeching, embarrassed halt by a man who refuses to move. And if that isn't a hilarious victory for the human spirit, I don't know what is. I'd like to think that somewhere that man finally got home, put his groceries on the counter, and had a very satisfying cup of tea, blissfully unaware that he had just rendered the entire concept of totalitarianism look like a clumsy, rusted-out failure. Chapter 6. The Batmania Summer. By June of 1989, the world had apparently decided that its problems, the crumbling of empires, the spilling of oil, and the birth of a global spiderweb, were simply too much to handle without the intervention of a man dressed as a nocturnal flying mammal. I have seen many forms of madness in my time: the Mississippi gold fever, the obsession with spiritualist table rappings, and the strange delusion that a necktie is a comfortable piece of clothing, but nothing quite prepared me for the summer of Batmania. It was a phenomenon that turned the entire planet black and yellow, as if the human race had suddenly entered into a collective pact to worship a very large, very brooding hornet. Everywhere I looked, the bat signal, that silhouette of a bat that looks remarkably like a set of poorly maintained dental bridges, was plastered on T-shirts, lunch boxes, and the foreheads of impressionable toddlers. It was a triumph of marketing over sanity, and as a man who once tried to sell a self-pasting scrapbook, I could only tip my hat to the sheer, unadulterated gall of it. The return of the masked millionaire. Now, I remember the Batman of the 1960s. He was a cheerful fellow in bright blue tights who spent his afternoons punching people while colorful words like BIF and POW appeared in midair. It was a dignified, if slightly hallucinogenic, profession. But the Batman of 1989, delivered to us by a young director named Tim Burton, was a different breed of cat, or bat, as the case may be. Burton's Gotham City was a place that appeared to have been designed by an architect who had suffered a nervous breakdown in a coal mine. It was a landscape of steam, soot, and gargoyles, where the sun never seemed to rise and the electricity bill must have been astronomical. Into this gloom stepped Michael Keaton, a man previously known for his comedic, nervous energy, now encased in several inches of industrial-grade rubber. I found the costume particularly fascinating. It was less a suit of clothes and more a mobile sarcophagus. The neck was so stiff that if Batman wanted to look at something to his left, he had to rotate his entire torso like a revolving gun turret. It is a testament to the power of cinema that we can watch a man struggle to turn his head to see a villain and still find him intimidating. In my day, if a man couldn't turn his neck, we didn't call him a superhero. We called him a victim of a very poor starching at the laundry. the gospel of the utility belt. What truly captured the American imagination, however, was not the man, but his gadgets. I have long observed that the American heart beats fastest for a hero who has a tool for every occasion. We are a nation of tinkerers and patent seekers. We love the idea that if you have enough money and a sufficiently organized belt, you can solve any problem, including a psychopathic clown or a midlife crisis. Batman, or Bruce Wayne to his creditors, is the ultimate expression of the masked millionaire trope. He didn't get his powers from a radioactive spider or a distant planet. He got them from a massive inheritance and a very efficient supply chain. He is the Gilded Age tycoon with a hobby. He is Andrew Carnegie with a grappling hook, John D. Rockefeller with a batarang. In 1989, at the tail end of a decade that had famously declared greed is good, Batman was the perfect hero. He proved that you could be fabulously wealthy, broodingly depressed, and still be the good guy, provided you spent your evenings beating up the less fortunate while wearing a cape. It was the trickle-down theory applied to vigilantism. If the millionaire at the top has enough high-tech toys, eventually the streets will be safer for everyone else. The scoundrel in the purple suit. Of course, a hero is only as interesting as the man trying to kill him, and in this regard, 1989 gave us a masterpiece. Jack Nicholson as the Joker was a revelation. While Batman was a stoic lump of rubber, the Joker was a riot of color, chaos, and murderous punchlines. I have always had a soft spot for a good scoundrel. The Joker was a man who understood that if you're going to be a villain, you might as well have a theme song and a decent tailor. He was a surrealist with a Tommy gun, turning a museum into a crime scene while dancing to the music of a fellow named Prince, a musician who, in 1989, appeared to be the only person on Earth capable of wearing more purple than the Joker himself. The Joker's philosophy was simple. Life is a joke, and death is the punchline. In a year where the universal spiderweb was being born and the Iron Curtain was fraying, there was something disturbingly relatable about a man who looked at the order of the world and decided it needed a fresh coat of neon paint and a few well-placed explosions. He was the ghost of the 19th century anarchist, updated for the era of cable television. The merchandising of the soul. The most hilarious part of Batmania was not the movie itself, but the merchandising. I walked into a department store in 1989 and felt as though I had been swallowed by a giant bat. There were bat cereals, bat shampoos, and bat vitamin supplements. I half expected to find bat-branded tobacco, which I would have bought on principle. This was the summer when the movie stopped being a piece of art and started being a global brand launch. We weren't just watching a story, we were participating in a retail event. People weren't wearing the Bat logo because they were fans of the character's complex psychological trauma. They were wearing it because everyone else was wearing it. It was a universal spiderweb of cotton and polyester. I saw a man in a full business suit, a man who likely spent his days discussing municipal bonds, carrying a briefcase with a Batman sticker on it. It seems that in the modern era, the only way to retain one's sanity in a world of high-speed information and shifting borders is to cling to the symbols of our childhood. We're all Bruce Wayne, hiding our secret silly selves under the stiff, rubberized suit of professionalism. The darkening of the American dream. As I look back on that summer, I realized that Batman marked a shift in the American temperament. We were moving away from the sunny, neon pink optimism of the early '80s and into something gritty. Gritty is a word that people in the 1980s used to describe things that were dark, damp, and featured at least one character who hadn't smiled since 1974. We were beginning to realize that the future we had been promised, the one with the flying cars and the silver jumpsuits, was actually going to be a bit more complicated. It was going to be a world of crumbling infrastructure, digital noise, and masked millionaires. The summer of Batmania was the world's way of practicing for the 1990s. We were learning to find comfort in the shadows. We were deciding that our heroes didn't need to be perfect. They just needed to be richer than the villains and have better music. I'll admit, I enjoyed the spectacle. There is something profoundly human about the sight of 1 million people all deciding to be obsessed with the same imaginary rodent at the same time. It's a reminder that no matter how many universal spiderwebs we build or how many iron curtains we tear down, we are still a species that can be easily distracted by a man in a cape and a really loud soundtrack. As for me, I'll stick to the river. The Mississippi doesn't have a theme song, it doesn't wear rubber, and it doesn't need a utility belt to get the job done. But if someone wants to put a bat signal on the front of a steamboat, I wouldn't be entirely opposed to the idea. It might help with the navigation in the fog. Chapter 7. The Show About Nothing. By July of 1989, the world was, as we've established, a rather busy place. People were busy tearing down walls in Europe, spilling oil in Alaska, and dressing up as bats in the local cinema. It was a time of grand narratives, sweeping historical shifts, and the kind of high-stakes drama that usually requires a symphony orchestra and a very large flag. And then, on the night of July 5th, a television program debuted on NBC called The Seinfeld Chronicles. It was a show that proudly proclaimed to be about nothing. Now, I have spent a lifetime writing about nothing. I have written 3,000 words on the precise way a frog jumps and 10,000 words on the specialized vocabulary of a Mississippi deckhand. I know better than anyone that nothing is where all the real something happens. While the history books are busy recording the dates of treaties and the names of generals, the rest of us are busy living in the gaps, wondering why our laundry disappeared, why the person in front of us at the grocery store is moving with the speed of a tectonic plate, and why we are currently being lectured by a man whose breath smells like a damp cellar. The Prophet of the Mundane. The show featured a young man named Jerry Seinfeld, a comedian whose primary talent was an ability to be perpetually mildly annoyed by things that most people simply accept as the price of being alive. Jerry is a modern-day observer, a fellow who looks at the world not with the fiery indignation of a reformer, but with the squinted eyes of a man trying to find the best buy date on a carton of milk. In my day, if you wanted to be a humorist, you had to have a perspective. You had to have a target. You had to be satirizing the government, the church, or the peculiar habit of Southern gentlemen shooting each other over a perceived slight at a card table. Jerry Seinfeld, however, realized that in 1989, the greatest target for satire was the etiquette of the everyday. He realized that we are no longer governed by kings, but by the unspoken rules of the dry cleaner. We are no longer judged by our valor in battle, but by whether or not we double-dip a chip at a party. It is a brilliant, terrifying shift in the human condition. We have solved the problem of smallpox, but we have yet to solve the problem of how to end a phone call with a person who doesn't understand that, "Well, I'll let you go," is a desperate plea for mercy. The anatomy of the grievance. The nothing that the show focused on was the exquisite machinery of human pettiness. I felt a kinship with it immediately. There is a character named George Costanza, a man who is essentially a walking, talking pile of insecurities and bad decisions. George is the patron saint of the small lie. In my writing, I have always found that the small, unnecessary lie is much more interesting than the large, purposeful one. A man lies about his age to get into the Army. That's boring. But a man lies about being a marine biologist simply because he doesn't want to admit he spends his afternoons eating deli meat in his underwear. That is the very essence of the human spirit. George represents that part of us that is constantly at war with the world's expectations. He is the man who believes that the entire universe is a conspiracy designed to deny him a decent parking spot. In the 19th century, we would have called him a ne'er-do-well or a scoundrel. In 1989, he was simply relatable. It says something profound about the progress of civilization that our villains have shrunk from the size of Napoleon to the size of a man who complains about the quality of a complimentary napkin. The digital confession booth. Seinfeld arrived just as the universal spiderweb was beginning to spin, and it captured the technological anxieties of the era perfectly. Take, for instance, the answering machine. In 1989, the answering machine was a device that allowed you to play a game of social Russian roulette. You would call someone, pray they weren't home, and then find yourself paralyzed by the terror of the beep. What do you say? How do you sound casual when you are talking to a piece of brown magnetic tape? The show understood that technology doesn't make our lives easier. It just gives us more ways to be embarrassed. We used to write letters, which allowed for reflection, editing, and the occasional strategic ink blot. Now, we leave messages that can be replayed, analyzed, and used as evidence in a trial of our own social incompetence. The answering machine was the first step toward the modern era where our every fleeting thought is recorded for posterity, usually to our eternal regret. The close talker and the social frontier. Then there is the matter of personal space. In the 19th century, personal space was generally defined by the length of a man's walking stick or the range of his tobacco spit. We were a physical, crowded people. But by 1989, Americans had developed a very specific and delicate social bubble. Seinfeld identified the close talker, that individual who insists on conducting a conversation at a distance usually reserved for dental exams and intimate secrets. I have met many close talkers in my time. Most of them were politicians seeking a loan or creditors seeking a payment. But Seinfeld treated it as a cosmic horror. It showed that our real struggles aren't with the great powers of the world, but with the person who stands too close to us at a cocktail party. We are a species that has conquered the moon, yet we are utterly defeated by a man who doesn't understand the invisible 3-foot perimeter of human dignity. The Chinese restaurant of the soul. There is an episode, though it came a bit later in the run, The spirit of it was there from the pilot, where the characters spend the entire half hour waiting for a table in a Chinese restaurant. Nothing happens. They don't get the table. They don't have a grand epiphany. They just wait. This is the most honest depiction of life I have ever seen. Most of human existence is not spent in the great moments. It is spent in the lobby. It is spent waiting for the train, waiting for the water to boil, or waiting for a person named Cohen to show up so you can finally have some duck. In the old world, we filled that waiting time with contemplation or prayer. In 1989, we filled it with complaints and observations about the people standing next to us. We have become a race of waiters, and Jerry Seinfeld is our head waiter, pointing out that the menu is overpriced and the service is indifferent. The triumph of the trivial. Why did this show about nothing become such a titan? I believe it's because by 1989, the big things had become too big to grasp. The Cold War was ending, the climate was shifting, and the universal spiderweb was expanding. It was all very grand and very exhausting. People needed a place where the biggest problem was a misplaced sock or a puffy shirt. We needed to be reminded that while the walls of history are falling, our own small walls, the ones we build out of social etiquette and petty grievances, are still standing. Seinfeld proved that the trivial is the only thing that is truly universal. Every human being on this planet, regardless of their language or their politics, has felt the silent fury of a slow elevator. Every human being has wondered if they are sponge-worthy. Every human being has experienced the stare down with a person they vaguely recognize but don't want to talk to. As a writer, I admire the discipline of it. To make nothing interesting is the hardest job in the world. It requires a surgeon's precision and a comedian's soul. It requires you to look at the mundane details of life, the things we usually ignore, and realize that they are the very bricks and mortar of our existence. A toast to the mundane. As I watch the credits roll on the early episodes of the Seinfeld Chronicles, I realize that this is the true record of the year 1989. The history books will tell you about the Berlin Wall. Seinfeld will tell you why the people on both sides of that wall were likely annoyed by their neighbors' noise levels and the quality of their local deli. We are a petty, magnificent, ridiculous species. We build satellites to photograph the stars, Chapter 8. And then we use the technology to complain about our soup being cold. We are the only creatures in the universe who can hold a velvet revolution, Chapter 12, and then spend the next day arguing about whether or not it's okay to break up with someone via a message on a machine. I'll take the show about nothing over a grand epic any day of the week, because in the end, life is just a series of small nothings that add up to the only something we ever truly have. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to go see a man about a marble rye. I'm told it's quite the ordeal. Chapter 8. The Neptune Flyby. I have always maintained that the best way to see the world is from the deck of a steamboat, where the pace is set by the current and the scenery changes just slowly enough for a man to form a solid opinion about a particular willow tree. But in August of 1989, humanity decided that the world was no longer quite large enough to contain its curiosity. We decided to take our inquisitive noses and poke them into the very furthest corner of the celestial attic, a place called Neptune. The vessel for this journey was not a grand ship of the line, Nor was it a puffing riverboat with a calliope playing Dixie. It was a clattering, spindly bucket of bolts called Voyager 2. Now, Voyager 2 had been traveling since 1977. To give you an idea of the technological era that birthed this machine, it was launched back when people thought leisure suits were a sensible sartorial choice and that a pet rock was an acceptable substitute for a friend. By 1989, Voyager 2 had been on the road for 12 years. It had already visited Jupiter, Saturn, and Uranus, the three previous stops on the giant gas ball tour, and was now approaching the last picket fence of the solar system. It was a 12-year journey conducted in total silence, punctuated only by the occasional beep back to Earth, like a teenager calling home from a cross-country trip only when they need more gas money. The most expensive message in a bottle. I find the anatomy of Voyager 2 to be a masterpiece of human optimism. It carries a golden record, a literal phonograph record made of gold-plated copper containing the sounds of Earth. It has greetings in 55 languages, the sound of a mother kissing her child, and a collection of music ranging from Bach to Chuck Berry. Think about the sheer unadulterated gall of that. We have sent a greeting card into the infinite void, hoping that some three-headed inhabitant of the Andromeda Galaxy will happen upon it, find a needle and a turntable, and conclude that the inhabitants of Earth are a pleasant musical lot who enjoy Johnny B. Good. I suspect that if an alien civilization ever does find it, they won't be impressed by our music. They'll be terrified by the fact that we sent a gold-plated circular saw blade flying through their neighborhood at 38,000 miles per hour. But in 1989, Voyager wasn't looking for aliens. It was looking for a blue marble, the blue eye in the dark. When the images began to trickle back to Earth through the universal spiderweb, which was still just a digital spiderling at the time, the world gasped. Neptune was beautiful. It was a deep, haunting azure, the kind of blue you only see in a very expensive sapphire or a very depressed poet's inkwell. It was also home to a great dark spot. Now, Jupiter has a great red spot, which is a hurricane that has been raging for 3 centuries. Neptune, apparently feeling a bit of sibling rivalry, decided to produce its own version. It was a storm the size of the Earth, a swirling vortex of wind that moves at 1,300 miles per hour. I've seen some wind in my time. I've seen a Missouri tornado pick up a barn and deposit it in the next county with the livestock still inside. But 1,300 miles per hour, that's not weather. That's a personal insult from the physics of the universe. If you stood on Neptune, you wouldn't just lose your hat. You'd lose your skeleton, your family history, and your very soul before you could even say, "It's a bit breezy today, isn't it?" The moon that goes the wrong way. Then there was Triton, Neptune's largest moon. Triton is the rebel of the solar system. Every other major moon in our neighborhood orbits in the same direction as its planet's rotation. Triton, however, decided that it didn't like the status quo. It orbits in the opposite direction, a retrograde orbit. I liked Triton immediately. It has the temperament of a man who walks into a ballroom and insists on dancing the waltz while everyone else is doing the polka. It's a moon with a mind of its own. It's also one of the coldest places in the universe, with temperatures hovering around minus 235 degrees Celsius. It is so cold that nitrogen, the stuff that makes up most of the air we breathe, actually freezes and falls as pink snow. I have spent some winters in Hartford that I thought were cold, but I have never seen pink nitrogen snow. It sounds like something Dali, refer to Chapter 1, would have painted after a particularly heavy dinner. Voyager's cameras showed us geysers of liquid nitrogen shooting 5 miles into the sky. It's a landscape of frozen cantaloupe skin and icy volcanoes. It was a reminder that the universe is not just large, it is profoundly, delightfully weird. The last picket fence. As Voyager 2 sailed past Neptune and headed out into the deep dark, the interstellar space between the stars, it marked the end of an era. For the first time in human history, we had completed the grand tour. We had looked at every major planet in our little yard. We had finally reached the last picket fence. There's a certain melancholy in this. For thousands of years, the planets were gods. They were bright, mysterious lights that governed our destinies and inspired our myths. Mars was war. Venus was love. Neptune was the god of the sea. In 1989, we turned them into data. We realized that Neptune isn't a god with a trident. It's a giant ball of hydrogen, helium, and methane with a very bad wind problem. We have traded the mystery for the fact. And while facts are very useful for things like building bridges and avoiding shipwrecks, they aren't nearly as good at keeping a man company at 3 o'clock in the morning. I looked at the photos of Neptune, that lonely blue eye staring back from the edge of the dark, and I felt a strange sense of kinship. Voyager 2 is a solitary traveler, a machine that will continue to drift through the stars for millions of years, long after the universal spiderweb has rusted away and the Berlin Wall is a forgotten footnote. It is the ultimate steamboat on the river of time, moving through a current that never ends. The hubris of the ape. But leave it to humanity to take a moment of cosmic wonder and turn it into a competition. In 1989, we weren't just celebrating the voyage, we were celebrating the fact that we did it. We had sent our mechanical eyes to the edge of the sun's reach and proved that we are the smartest apes in the jungle. We seem to think that because we can photograph a planet, we own it. We've mapped the picket fence, and now we're looking for the next yard. We are like the pioneers who crossed the plains only to reach the Pacific and wonder if there's a way to walk on the water. We are a species that cannot sit still. I suspect that the great dark spot on Neptune is actually the planet's way of winking at us. It's saying, go ahead, take your pictures, send your gold records, but remember, you are just a speck of dust on a slightly warmer rock. And I've been swirling in the dark since before your ancestors figured out how to use a thumb. I'll still be blue, and I'll still be cold long after you've forgotten how to turn on your Game Boys. Chapter 4. The Long Goodbye. As August turned to September, Voyager 2's mission officially ended. It began its long, slow exit from the solar system. Its cameras were turned off to save power, and it entered a state of electronic hibernation. It is now a ghost ship, a flying museum piece, sailing into a night that has no dawn. It is the most successful traveler in history. It didn't get lost, unlike the Exxon Valdez in Chapter 3. It didn't get bogged down in petty grievances, unlike the characters in Seinfeld in Chapter 7. And it didn't stop to take a nap, unlike Captain Hazelwood. It just kept going. I raised a glass to that little bucket of bolts. It reached the picket fence and kept right on walking. In a year full of walls falling and empires crumbling, there was something reassuring about a machine that just wanted to see what was around the next bend in the river. The solar system is a smaller place now. We've seen the attic, we've seen the basement, and we've realized that while the neighborhood is fascinating, it's also very, very empty. Perhaps that's why we're so obsessed with the universal spider web and the Game Boys. We're trying to fill the silence that Voyager 2 discovered at the edge of the world. But at least we know one thing for certain. If we ever do meet an alien and he happens to have a turntable, he's going to think we really, really like Chuck Berry. And that, in my opinion, is a legacy worth leaving. Chapter 9. The Cold Fusion Illusion. If there is one thing I have learned from my long and checkered career as an observer of the human comedy, it is that the average man would rather believe in a miracle than a mathematical certainty. We are a species of prospectors, perpetually looking for a something-for-nothing scheme that doesn't involve a pickaxe or a blister. We have spent centuries chasing the fountain of youth, the philosopher's stone, and a brand of tobacco that doesn't leave a man smelling like a burnt haystack. In March of 1989, the world thought it had finally found the big one, the magic lamp of energy. Two gentlemen from the University of Utah, Stanley Pons and Martin Fleischmann, stepped before a forest of microphones and declared that they had managed to put the sun in a jar. They called it cold fusion. By my reckoning, it was the greatest patent medicine show in the history of physics, only instead of a tonic that cured both gout and social anxiety, they were selling a future where electricity was as free as the air and just as invisible. The alchemy of the kitchen sink. To understand why the world lost its collective mind, one must first understand what fusion actually is. In the 19th century, we got our energy by burning rocks and wood, a messy, smoky business that left the world covered in soot. In the 20th century, we discovered fission, which involves splitting atoms apart like a divorce court judge splitting a family estate. It works, but it leaves behind radioactive waste, which is essentially a trash bag that stays hot and angry for 10,000 years. Fusion, however, is the Holy Grail. It is the process of squeezing two atoms together until they become one, releasing a burst of energy in the process. It's what the sun does for a living. The problem is that the sun has a very high overhead. It requires temperatures of millions of degrees and the pressure of 1 billion atmospheres. The formula for the real stuff, the kind that powers the stars, is usually written something like this. D plus T yields 4, He plus N plus 17.6 mega electron volts. This equation tells us that if you take deuterium, D, and tritium, T, smash them together, you get helium-4, 4He, a neutron, N, and a whole lot of energy. But to get that reaction to happen on Earth, you usually need a laboratory the size of a cathedral and enough electricity to dim the lights in 3 states. Pons and Fleischmann claimed they did it in a glass beaker using a rod of palladium, a gallon of heavy water, an electrical current no stronger than what you'd use to toast a bagel. It was the ultimate everyman's miracle. It suggested that the secrets of the universe weren't hidden in a multi-billion-dollar particle accelerator, like the one at CERN we discussed in Chapter 2, but were tucked away in the back of a chemistry closet in Salt Lake City. The press conference of infinite hope. Now, in the old days of science, if you discovered a way to rewrite the laws of thermodynamics, you wrote a paper, you sent it to your peers, and you waited 6 months for them to tell you why you were wrong. It was a slow, dignified process. But this was 1989. This was the era of the global gossip parlor. Instead of waiting for peer review, the University of Utah held a press conference. They bypassed the scientists and went straight to the evening news. Within 24 hours, the world was in a state of cold fusion fever. The stock market began to twitch. Oil companies began to sweat. Every man with a basement and a set of jumper cables began to wonder if he could power his house with a jar of pickles and a silver spoon. I watched the footage of the two scientists. They looked like perfectly reasonable men, which is always the most dangerous kind. A man in a wizard's hat is easy to dismiss. A man in a lab coat and a sensible tie can convince you to invest your life savings in a machine that turns lead into feathers. They promised a world where pollution-free energy would be so cheap we wouldn't even bother to meter it. The great replication race. The problem with a miracle is that it has to be repeatable. If a man claims he can walk on water, he'd better be prepared to do it again when the skeptics show up with their cameras. Immediately, every laboratory in the world, from MIT to Caltech to a fellow I know in Hannibal, who is very good with a soldering iron, tried to replicate the experiment. They got their beakers, they got their palladium rods, and they waited for the excess heat. They waited, and they waited. Science is a wonderful thing if one does not have to earn one's living at it, but it is a cruel mistress when you are trying to find a neutron that refuses to exist. The skeptics began to point out a few minor inconsistencies. You see, if you are truly doing fusion, you should be producing a veritable hail of neutrons. If Pons and Fleischmann were actually producing as much energy as they claimed, the resulting radiation should have turned them both into glow-in-the-dark statues within the first 20 minutes. The fact that they were standing there, healthy and unfried, suggested that either they were the luckiest men in history or the fusion wasn't actually fusing. The anatomy of the illusion. It turns out that measuring heat in a jar of water is a remarkably tricky business. If you aren't careful, you can mistake a chemical reaction or even a slight error in your thermometer for the birth of a new sun. As the weeks went by, the miracle began to crumble like a stale cookie. Other scientists couldn't find the neutrons. They couldn't find the helium. They could barely find a reason to keep the lights on in the lab. The excess heat turned out to be a ghost, a statistical hiccup that vanished the moment a skeptical eye was turned toward it. The University of Utah, which had already begun dreaming of fusion royalties that would allow them to pave the entire state in gold, suddenly found itself in the middle of a scientific scandal. It was the cardboard city of physics. It looked great from a distance, but it couldn't stand up to a light rain. The something-for-nothing syndrome. I find the whole affair to be a magnificent testament to human gullibility. We wanted cold fusion to be real. We wanted it so badly that we were willing to ignore the most basic laws of the universe. We live on a planet where everything has a price. If you want heat, you have to burn something. If you want speed, you have to pay in friction. But the magic lamp of 1989 promised us a way to cheat the ledger. It promised us that we could have the sun's power without the sun's temper. It's the same impulse that leads a man to buy a self-filling pipe or a perpetual motion butter churn. It is the desire to find a loophole in the contract of existence. We are a race of dreamers, and 1989 was a year of particularly vivid dreams. From the universal spiderweb to the pocket-sized frontier, we were convinced that technology was about to solve all our problems for us. The aftermath of the jar. By the end of the year, cold fusion had moved from the front page to the weird news section. Pons and Fleischmann eventually left the country, pursued by the metaphorical villagers with torches, or at least the metaphorical scientists with very sharp peer-reviewed journals. But the illusion never truly died. To this day, there are still believers, men in garages and remote laboratories who are convinced that the establishment suppressed the secret to free energy. They are the modern-day alchemists, still stirring their jars of heavy water, waiting for the spark that will change the world. I don't blame them. It's a lovely dream. The idea that we could solve the black tide of Alaska, Chapter 3, and the Cold War, Chapter 18, just by putting a metal rod in a jar of water is almost too good to pass up. The TwAInian warning. As I look back on the cold fusion illusion of 1989, I am reminded of a simple rule for navigating the 20th, 21st, and any other centuries that might follow. Whenever someone promises you something for nothing, check your wallet, check your thermometer, and then check for the nearest exit. The universe is many things, vast, blue, cold, and occasionally inhabited by men with shopping bags, but it is rarely free. The sun works hard for its energy, and if we want a piece of it, we're going to have to do the work too. In the meantime, if you see a man in a lab coat selling magic jars, I suggest you stick to your wood fire. It might be smoky, and it might be old-fashioned, but at least when you put a log on the fire, you know exactly why your toes are getting warm. The year 1989 taught us that we can tear down walls and we can photograph the edge of the solar system, but we still haven't found a way to outsmart a thermometer. And frankly, that's probably for the best. If energy were free, we'd probably just use it to power more Game Boys and Seinfeld marathons, and the planet would be just as messy as it was before. Onward then to the next miracle. I hear there's an earthquake scheduled for the World Series, and unlike cold fusion, that one is actually going to happen. Chapter 10. The Ground Shakes the Series. I have lived in San Francisco. I have walked its hills, breathed its fog, and contributed my fair share to its local legends. It is a city that perches on the edge of the continent with the precarious grace of a seagull on a chimney pot. People who live there possess a peculiar kind of optimism. They build magnificent structures on top of what is essentially a geological trapdoor, and then they act surprised when the floor occasionally drops out from under them. In October of 1989, the city and its neighbor across the bay, Oakland, were embroiled in a tribal ritual of the highest order, the World Series. Now, World Series is a term of considerable hubris, as it implies that the entire planet is holding its breath to see which group of men in pajamas can hit a ball with a stick. In reality, it was a local squabble between two California neighbors, the Giants and the Athletics, nicknamed the Bay Bridge Series. The atmosphere was thick with the scent of hot dogs, regional pride, and a certain smug satisfaction that the center of the universe had officially moved to Northern California. But at 5:04 p.m. on October 17th, the Earth itself decided it had heard quite enough about batting averages. The great geological shrug. I have observed that nature has a very low tolerance for human self-importance. We build our stadiums, we arrange our television cameras, and we declare grand events. Nature, meanwhile, is like an elderly landlord who hasn't been paid the rent and has finally decided to settle the matter by shaking the building until the tenants fall out of bed. The Loma Prieta earthquake was not a subtle affair. It was a 6.9 magnitude reminder that the San Andreas Fault does not recognize the authority of the commissioner of baseball. I have been through a temblor or two in my time. It is a sensation that begins as a low, guttural growl in the bowels of the earth, much like a steam boiler about to give up the ghost, and quickly escalates into a state of affairs where the sidewalk begins to behave like a disturbed snake. In Candlestick Park, 62,000 fans were settling into their seats. They were prepared for a battle of nerves and athletic prowess. What they got instead was a 15-second demonstration of the fact that the ground we stand on is merely a suggestion, not a contract. I watched the footage of the event, and it was a masterpiece of accidental drama. The television signal flickered, the cameras began to dance a frantic jig, and the commentator, a fellow named Al Michaels, managed to utter the words, "I'll tell you what, we're having an earth," before the screen turned to the gray fuzz of electronic oblivion. The silence of the airwaves. There is nothing quite as terrifying to a modern person as a television screen that has gone blank during a live event. We have become so accustomed to the universal spiderweb, Chapter 2, providing us with a continuous stream of noise that when the noise stops, we assume the world has ended. For the millions of people watching at home, the World Series had suddenly become the world silence. For those in the stadium, however, it was a moment of profound confusion. I'm told that for the first few seconds, many fans thought the shaking was simply a particularly enthusiastic wave, or perhaps a very large airplane passing overhead. It is a testament to human vanity that we would rather believe 60,000 people are simultaneously stomping their feet than admit the planet is trying to swallow us whole. When the shaking stopped, the stadium remained standing, a credit to the engineers, or perhaps just a bit of luck from the Almighty. But the game was over. You cannot play baseball when the outfield has ripples in it and the lights have gone out. The Bay Bridge series had been interrupted by the very bridge it was named after. The bridge that folded. While the fans at Candlestick were dusting themselves off and wondering if they could get a refund on their beer, a much darker tragedy was unfolding a few miles away. The Bay Bridge, that majestic steel artery connecting the two cities, had suffered a mechanical failure of the most literal kind. A section of the upper deck had simply collapsed onto the lower deck. It is a sobering sight to see a man-made wonder, something we have built to defy gravity and span the abyss, fold like a piece of wet cardboard. It proves my theory that our machines are only as reliable as the ground they're bolted to. We spend billions of dollars on stress tests and safety margins, and then the Earth gives a single bored shrug and shows us that our margins are a joke. Further north, the Cypress Street Viaduct in Oakland, a double-decker freeway, collapsed entirely, trapping hundreds of people in a concrete sandwich. It was a grim reminder that our high-speed lifestyle comes with a high-stakes price tag. We build our roads on top of each other because we are in such a hurry to get to the next nothing, Chapter 7. And we forget that concrete is a heavy mistress when she decides to lie down. The heroism of the ordinary. In the aftermath of the quake, something remarkable happened, something that almost makes me forgive the human race for its obsession with Game Boys. Chapter 4. With the power out and the emergency services overwhelmed, the ordinary citizens of San Francisco and Oakland stepped into the breach. I saw footage of people in business suits and people in rags working side by side to pull survivors from the rubble of the freeway. They didn't have blast processing, and they didn't have utility belts. They just had their hands and a refusal to look the other way. This is the TwAInian truth of a disaster. It strips away the masked millionaire, Chapter 6 nonsense, and reveals the actual quality of the neighbors. In the dark, smoky streets of the Marina District, where the ground had turned to liquefaction, a fancy word for mud that used to be a foundation, people were helping each other move their belongings and share their water. The World Series rivalry was forgotten. A giant and an athletic look remarkably similar when they are both covered in plaster dust and trying to put out a fire with a garden hose. The Earth's indifference. What strikes me most about the 1989 earthquake is the Earth's total lack of information management. It didn't hold a press conference. It didn't release a cold fusion report, Chapter 9. It didn't even check to see if the television cameras were rolling. It just happened. We live in an era where we think everything is content. We think that if a tree falls in the forest and no one captures it on a 16-bit video game, it didn't really happen. The Loma Prieta earthquake reminded us that there is a world outside our screens, a world that is vast, ancient, and entirely indifferent to our batting averages or our prime-time advertising slots. The earthquake didn't care about the World Series. It didn't care about the universal spiderweb. It didn't even care about the Tank Man. Chapter 5. It was a geological event, as dispassionate as a math equation and as final as a tombstone. The return to the diamond. 10 days later, the World Series resumed. The lights came back on, the cracks in the walls were patched, and the men in pajamas returned to the field. There was a great deal of talk about resilience and healing and the power of sport to bring us together. I suppose there is some truth to it. We need our games to distract us from the fact that we are living on a tectonic time bomb. But I suspect the Earth was just waiting for us to get back to our seats so it could go back to sleep. The Athletics went on to win the series in a sweep, though I doubt anyone in the Bay Area remembers the score. What they remember is the sound of the world grinding its teeth. They remember the way the air felt when the music stopped, and they remember that for 15 seconds in October, the world part of the World Series was finally terrifyingly accurate. As for me, I'll stick to the river. A river might flood, it might change its course, and it might occasionally wreck a steamboat, but it generally stays where you put it. It doesn't try to fold the bridge in half while you're driving home for dinner. The year 1989 was a year of walls falling and empires crumbling, but in San Francisco, it was the year the ground itself decided to join the revolution. And if that isn't a plot twist worthy of a playwright, Chapter 12, I don't know what is. Chapter 11, The Sledgehammer of History. I have observed in my long and varied travels across the surface of this terrestrial ball that man is the only animal that will spend 30 years building a wall to keep his neighbors out, only to spend the next 30 years complaining that he's lonely. We are a species of fence builders. We mark our territory with stones, brick, and occasionally with a kind of pointed ironwork that suggests a very low opinion of the person living next door. But the Berlin Wall was something altogether more sinister, and, by my reckoning, more hilariously misguided. It wasn't a fence designed to keep the cows in. It was a fence designed to keep the owners in the barn. In August of 1961, the East German government, a group of gentlemen who possessed the collective charm of a wet wool blanket, decided that their citizens were enjoying the Western lifestyle a bit too much. Their solution was simple. They woke up one morning and began unrolling barbed wire. Eventually, that wire became concrete. The concrete became a death strip. And for 28 years, the city of Berlin was divided like a birthday cake that no one was allowed to eat. Then came November 9th, 1989, and on that night, the world discovered that while a wall is easy to build with mortar and fear, it is surprisingly brittle when faced with the weight of 1 million people and a single catastrophic, bureaucratic oopsie. The revolution of the paperwork. If you were to ask a historian what caused the fall of the Berlin Wall, they might mention the Cold War, the Malta Summit, Chapter 18, or the Velvet Revolution, Chapter 12. But if you ask me, the wall fell because of a man named Günter Schabowski and his inability to read a memo. You see, the East German leadership had decided to loosen the travel restrictions slightly, mostly to stop people from jumping the fence and making them look bad on the universal spiderweb, Chapter 2. They gave a piece of paper to Schabowski, a government spokesman who looked as though he had been carved out of a turnip, and sent him out to a press conference. He was supposed to say that people could apply for travel permits starting the next day. Instead, when a reporter asked when the new rules took effect, Schabowski shuffled his papers, looked confused, and muttered, "As far as I know, it takes effect immediately, without delay." I have seen many powerful things in my life, a Mississippi flood, a lightning strike on a church steeple, and a mother-in-law's disapproval. But I have never seen anything quite as powerful as a poorly read government announcement. Within minutes, the news had traveled faster than a lie at a prayer meeting. Thousands of East Berliners dropped their dinner forks, put on their coats, and headed for the gates. The border guards, who had spent decades being told to shoot anyone who moved, suddenly found themselves staring at a sea of people asking, "Is it true? Can we go?" The guards looked at their manuals. The manuals didn't say anything about 1 million people asking politely. They tried to call their superiors. Their superiors were apparently busy having a nervous breakdown in private. Eventually, the guards did the only sensible thing. They shrugged, opened the gates, and let the 20th century in. The Sledgehammer Symphony. What followed was a scene that would have made a surrealist like Dali, Chapter 1, weep with joy. People from the east met people from the west on top of the wall. They weren't fighting, they were dancing. They weren't shouting slogans, they were sharing champagne. And then came the prospector, the wall woodpeckers. Imagine thousands of people armed with hammers, chisels, and kitchen spoons, all descending upon 100 miles of reinforced concrete. The sound was a rhythmic, metallic clatter that I call the Sledgehammer Symphony. They weren't waiting for the government to tear the wall down. They were doing it themselves, one pebble at a time. I find this profoundly TwAInian. There is something beautifully human about the sight of a man in a sweater taking a hammer to an empire. It proves that the most imposing structures of authority are often just stage sets that we all agree to pretend are real. Once we stop believing in the wall becomes nothing more than a very long, very ugly pile of rocks that is in the way of a good party. The Great American Yard Sale. Within 48 hours, the Berlin Wall had transitioned from a symbol of global oppression to a merchandise opportunity. I have always said that the American spirit is never far behind a revolution, and by the weekend, people were selling chunks of the wall on street corners. I saw pieces of concrete spray-painted with authentic graffiti being sold for 20 marks a pop. It was a masterpiece of capitalism. We took the most hated object in Europe and turned it into a collectible. I suspect that if you added up all the authentic pieces of the Berlin Wall sold in the last 30 years, you would have enough concrete to pave a highway from Berlin to San Francisco and back again. It reminds me of the true cross in the Middle Ages. There were enough fragments of it in Europe to build a fleet of ships. But in 1989, we didn't want the cross. We wanted a piece of the Iron Curtain to put on our mantelpiece next to our Game Boy. Chapter 4. We wanted a physical reminder that we had won and that we had the souvenir to prove it. The triumph of the Trabi. Then there were the cars. Oh, the cars. As the gates opened, thousands of East German Trabants, famously known as Trabis, poured into the West. Now, I have seen some questionable modes of transport. I have ridden on mules that were more aerodynamic and seen riverboats that leaked less. The Trabant was a car made of duroplast, a fancy word for recycled cotton and phenol resin. It was essentially a car made of pressed laundry and glue. It had a two-stroke engine that sounded like a lawn mower in a bucket of nails and emitted a cloud of blue smoke that could choke a dragon. But on that night, the Trabi was a chariot of fire. I watched as West Berliners cheered and patted the plastic hoods of these smoking, rattling little boxes. It was a parade of the imperfect, finally reaching the prosperous. It was a reminder that freedom doesn't always arrive in a shiny limousine. Sometimes it arrives in a car that smells like a wet dog and has to be pushed up a slight incline. The walls of the mind. As the dust settled and the champagne ran dry, the world began to realize that tearing down a wall of concrete is much easier than tearing down a wall of the mind. For 28 years, these people had lived in different universes. One side had Seinfeld, Chapter 7, and Batmania, Chapter 6. The other side had state-run radio and a very limited selection of sausages. Merging these two worlds was never going to be as simple as a handshake. You can remove the bricks, but you can't easily remove the suspicion, the resentment, and the sheer economic awkwardness of trying to trade a Duroplast car for a Mercedes-Benz. I looked at the falling wall and felt a twinge of my usual cynicism. We were tearing down a physical wall in Berlin, but at the very same moment, we were starting to spin the universal spiderweb. Chapter 2. We were replacing a wall of stone with a wall of information. I wonder if, in another 30 years, we will find ourselves trapped in a different kind of death strip, one made of digital noise and algorithmically curated echoes, where we can see our neighbors, but we can't actually touch them. The final sledgehammer. But for one glorious night in November, none of that mattered. For one night, the world felt unified. The sledgehammer of history had swung, and it had hit the mark. It was a victory for the ordinary man with the shopping bags. Chapter 5. It was a victory for the playwrights. Chapter 12. And the poets. It was a reminder that history isn't made by the men in the stone palaces. It's made by the people who show up at the gate and refuse to leave until the keys are turned. As a man who has seen his share of reconstructions and new eras, I was moved. I raised my glass to the Berliners, east and west. They had turned a prison into a playground, and they had done it without a single shot being fired, well, except for the corks of a few thousand bottles of sect. The wall was gone. The map of the world was being redrawn in crayon by a million happy hands. And while I knew the hangover was coming, the party was, by my reckoning, the best one the 19th century never got to attend. Chapter 12. The Velvet Revolution. I have spent a considerable amount of time in theaters, mostly looking for a way to sleep through a particularly dreary second act, or trying to determine if the lead actor is truly weeping or merely suffering from a bad case of the hay fever. I have seen tragedies that were comedies and comedies that were, quite frankly, tragedies. But I have never seen a production quite as elegant, quite as well-paced, or quite as fundamentally absurdist as the one that took place in Czechoslovakia in the autumn of 1989. Most revolutions are messy, loud, and involve a distressing amount of gunpowder. They are usually directed by men with very loud voices and very large swords who believe that the only way to clear a stage is to burn the theater down. But the Czechs and the Slovaks, a people who have been squeezed between the tectonic plates of European empires for centuries, decided to do something different. They staged a velvet revolution. It sounds like something you'd buy in a high-end upholstery shop, doesn't it? A revolution that is soft to the touch, pleasing to the eye, and doesn't leave any permanent stains on the carpet. It was a revolution that proved my long-held suspicion. The most dangerous weapon in the world is not a cannon, but a well-placed metaphor in the hands of a man who knows how to use a semicolon. The scriptwriter in the cellar. The protagonist of this particular drama was a fellow named Václav Havel. Now, in any other century, a man like Havel would have spent his life in quiet obscurity, perhaps occasionally emerging from a smoky cafe to complain about the quality of the local ink. He was a playwright, and not just any playwright, but a master of the theater of the absurd. If you are unfamiliar with the absurd, it is a genre where characters spend 3 hours talking to a trash can, while waiting for a man who doesn't exist to bring them a hat they didn't lose. It is, in other words, a perfect training ground for anyone living under a communist bureaucracy. For 20 years, the Czechoslovak government, a collection of gray, humorless men who looked like they had been born in a filing cabinet and fed on a diet of stale memos and ideological starch, had been trying to silence Havel. They banned his plays, they followed him into public toilets, and they periodically threw him in prison. They treated him as a dangerous criminal, failing to realize that you cannot imprison a man who finds your very existence to be a hilarious piece of fiction. Havel didn't fight them with bombs. He fought them with living in truth. He suggested that if everyone simply stopped pretending that the government's lies were true, the government would eventually evaporate like a bad smell in a brisk breeze. It was a radical idea, the notion that a regime built on a billion tiny nothing lies, Chapter 7, could be toppled by a single something truth. The general strike of the soul. The curtain rose on November 17th. It began with a student march in Prague, which the police attempted to edit with truncheons. In the old days, this would have been the end of the story. A few broken heads, a few dozen arrests, and back to the filing cabinets. But in 1989, the audience was no longer willing to follow the script. Within days, the streets of Prague were filled with hundreds of thousands of people, and here's where the velvet part really shines. They didn't come with pitchforks, they came with keys. I have seen many forms of protest. I once saw a group of sailors protest the quality of their biscuits by nailing them to the mast, but the jingling of the keys was a stroke of genius. 100,000 people in Wenceslas Square took out their house keys and began to shake them in unison. The sound was like a massive metallic wind chime. It was the sound of a country telling its government, "The locks are changed, and you don't have the new ones. It's time for you to go home." It was a protest that was civil, musical, and utterly devastating. How do you respond to 1,000,000 people jingling keys at you? You can't shoot a wind chime. You can't arrest a sound. The government, which was prepared for a war, found itself in the middle of a janitorial convention, and it had no idea how to handle the rejection. The 2-hour punctuation mark. The climax of the revolution occurred on November 27th, when the entire country participated in a 2-hour general strike. Think about that. For 2 hours, the entire nation simply stopped. The factories went silent, the trains stayed in the stations, and the bureaucrats sat at their desks looking at their watches. It was a national pause button. It was the people saying to the party, "We are the ones who make the wheels turn. If we don't want to turn them for you, you're just a group of old men sitting in a quiet room." It was the ultimate plot twist. Usually, a strike is a violent, angry affair. This was a polite demonstration of power. It was as if the entire population had collectively decided that the party was a bore, and they were all going to step out for a smoke at the same time. When the 2 hours were over, the government realized it was no longer the director of the play. It was merely a group of unconvincing extras in a show that had already been canceled. The philosopher king of the 20th century. By December, the regime had collapsed. They didn't go out in a blaze of glory. They went out like a leaky balloon, and in a final crowning irony that would have made any playwright weep with joy, Václav Havel, the man who had been a criminal and a janitor, yes, he once had to work in a brewery just to pay the rent, was elected president of Czechoslovakia. I find this profoundly satisfying. We usually elect presidents who are generals, lawyers, or men who are very good at selling insurance to people who live on floodplains. But in 1989, a nation decided it should be led by someone who understands a good metaphor. Havel's inaugural address was a masterpiece. He didn't promise 5-year plans or greater industrial tonnage. He looked at his people and said, "I assume you did not propose me for this office so that I, too, would lie to you." It was the most shocking thing a politician had said in 40 years. He moved into the Prague Castle, a sprawling ancient fortress that had housed kings and emperors, and promptly invited his rock and roll friends over for a visit. He reportedly rode a scooter through the long marble halls because he found the distance between his office and the bathroom to be absurdist. The lesson of the plot twist. As I look back at the Velvet Revolution from my vantage point on the universal spiderweb, I realize that it was the most important information management event of the year. It proved that you don't need a 16-bit war, Chapter 13, or a masked millionaire, Chapter 6, to save the world. You just need a population that has decided to stop being the audience for a bad play. The Czechs showed us that power is a performance. If the actors forget their lines, or if the audience refuses to clap, the play is over. The Iron Curtain wasn't torn down by the sledgehammer of history, Chapter 11 in Prague. It was simply folded up and put into storage because the production had run out of funding and the lead actors were no longer believable. I like to think that history is a book where the chapters on invading the mountains, Chapter 15, always end in failure. But the chapters on playwrights becoming presidents are the ones we should read twice. It gives a man hope. It suggests that perhaps the world isn't run by the people with the most tanks, but by the people who can tell the best story. The final curtain call. The year 1989 was a year of profound irony, as I have said before. While America was obsessed with a show about nothing, Chapter 7, Czechoslovakia was having a revolution about everything. While we were staring into small gray screens, Chapter 4, they were staring into the eyes of their oppressors and jingling their keys. Václav Havel proved that the pen is indeed mightier than the sword, provided you have enough people willing to help you hold the pen. He showed that life is indeed a plot twist, and that sometimes the best person to run the country is the man who spent his life wondering if the trash can was going to talk back. As the decade drew to a close, the Velvet was the only thing that felt real. The rest was just neon, noise, and digital dreams. But in Prague, for a few glorious weeks, the world was a theater. The truth was the star. And for once, the good guys didn't need a utility belt to win. They just needed a good script and a very large set of keys. I'll raise a glass to that, and then I'll see if I can find a scooter. I've always wanted to see how fast one goes on a marble floor. Chapter 13. The 16-bit war begins. I have observed, with a mixture of awe and genuine concern, that the human race possesses an unquenchable thirst for things that go faster than they have any right to. In my youth, a man was considered a daredevil if he steered a steamboat through a narrow chute at 15 miles an hour. Today, if a child's digital entertainment takes more than 3 seconds to materialize on a screen, he looks at the machine with the wounded expression of a man who has just been betrayed by his favorite dog. In August of 1989, the world of information management, which we discussed in Chapter 2, took a sharp, aggressive turn into the martial arts. This was the month the Sega Genesis arrived in North America, and with it, the opening salvos of what the history books call the 16-bit war. It was a conflict fought not with bayonets or diplomacy, but with marketing slogans, plastic cartridges, and a peculiar technological hallucination known as blast processing. The inflation of the bit. To understand the 16-bit war, one must first understand the bit. In the 19th century, a bit was a piece of silver worth 12.5 cents, enough to buy a decent cigar or a very questionable sandwich. In 1989, a bit was a unit of digital information, and for reasons that escape my common sense, having 16 of them was considered twice as virtuous as having 8. Nintendo, the reigning monarch of the pocket-sized frontier, Chapter 4, had conquered the world with their 8-bit system. It was a charming little box that produced music like a tin whistle and characters who looked like they were made out of mismatched floor tiles. But Sega, a company with the aggressive temperament of a riverboat gambler who has just lost his watch and is looking to double his bet, decided that 8 was a number for losers. They brought out the Genesis. It was sleek, it was black, and it looked like something a masked millionaire, Chapter 6, would use to record his brooding thoughts. It boasted 16-bit power. I have seen this kind of numerical inflation before. It's the same logic used by the men who sell triple distilled whiskey. The idea that if 1 of something is good and 2 is better, then 16 must be a direct ticket to salvation. In reality, it mostly meant that the grass in the video games was a slightly more realistic shade of green, and the explosions sounded less like a sneeze and more like a proper catastrophe. The gospel of blast processing. Sega's primary weapon in this war was a marketing incantation called blast processing. Now, as a man who has spent a fair amount of time listening to the tall tales of frontier scouts and the empty promises of mining speculators, I know a buzzword when I hear one. Blast processing sounds magnificent. It sounds like something that involves rocket fuel and a complete disregard for the structural integrity of the human cranium. The advertisements were relentless. They showed a Sega Genesis strapped to the back of a dragster, while the Nintendo Entertainment System, a name that suggests a far more boring experience than it delivered, was depicted as a slow, plodding milk wagon. The slogan was a masterpiece of grammatical insolence. Genesis does what Nintended. It is a terrible pun, a linguistic atrocity, and a brilliant piece of psychological warfare. It suggested that if you owned a Nintendo, you were a dusty relic of the 19th century, whereas if you owned a Genesis, you were a creature of the future, a person who lived on the edge and didn't mind if their games were occasionally too fast to actually play. When I looked into the technical reality of blast processing, I found that it was essentially a way of moving data that was slightly more efficient than the old way. It was the digital equivalent of greasing the wheels of a wagon. It's helpful, certainly, but it doesn't turn the wagon into a locomotive. But in 1989, the public didn't want the truth. They wanted the blast. They wanted to believe that for $189.99, they could buy a piece of the future that was too fast for their parents to understand. The comparison of the combatants. To help the reader understand the stakes of this conflict, I have prepared a small table of the opposing forces as they stood in the autumn of 1989. Feature: the Nintendo NES, the Sega Genesis. Color palette: 52 shades of childhood optimism, 512 shades of gritty 80s reality. Sound quality: a very talented electronic cricket, a synthesizer that wants to be a rock star. Mascot: a portly Italian plumber who likes mushrooms. A blue hedgehog with an attitude problem. Pace of play: a brisk Sunday walk in the park. A downhill luge run on a greased baking sheet. Philosophy: let's save the princess and be home by tea. I have things to do, places to be, and I'm late for all of them. The arrival of the blue blur. Every empire needs a figurehead. Nintendo had Mario, a man whose primary characteristics were his stout physique, his impressive mustache, and his inexplicable desire to spend his life crawling through plumbing to rescue a royal lady who seemed remarkably prone to being kidnapped. Mario was the everyman. He was patient, he was steady, and he was undeniably 8-bit. Sega realized that they couldn't compete with a plumber using another plumber. They needed an anti-Mario. They needed someone who represented the blast in blast processing. And so they gave us Sonic the Hedgehog. I have spent many years studying the wildlife of the American West, and I can tell you with absolute certainty that a real hedgehog is a slow, prickly creature that spends most of its time curled in a ball wondering if it's about to be stepped on. Sonic, however, was a bright blue hedgehog who wore red sneakers and moved at supersonic speeds. He didn't walk. He blurred. He didn't jump. He became a spinning saw blade of indigo fury. He was the perfect mascot for 1989, a year that was itself moving too fast for anyone to keep up with. Sonic didn't care about The Show About Nothing, Chapter 7, or The Neptune Flyby, Chapter 8. He only cared about going that way as fast as humanly possible while collecting gold rings for reasons that were never adequately explained in the brochure. The 16-bit conundrum. As I watched the youth of America hunch over their glowing television screens, their thumbs twitching with the speed of a hummingbird's wings, I found myself wondering about the long-term effects of this 16-bit lifestyle. We are teaching our children that faster is better. We are convincing them that the goal of life is to reach the end of the level in record time, preferably while ignoring the scenery and collecting as many shiny trinkets as possible. I worry that we are creating a generation of speed junkies who will find the real world, a place where trees take years to grow and the Mississippi takes months to move a single barge, to be intolerably sluggish. In my day, we valued the pause. We valued the slow accumulation of wisdom. But the Sega Genesis has no time for pauses. Even when you press the start button to stop the game, the music continues to throb with a restless digital energy as if the machine is tapping its foot and checking its watch, waiting for you to get back to the blast. The economics of the playground. The 16-bit war was also a war of the wallet. By 1989, social standing in the schoolyard was determined by which bit you possessed. If you were stuck in the 8-bit era, you were a dinosaur. If you moved to 16-bit, you were a pioneer. I saw fathers, men who likely didn't know a pixel from a picket fence, standing in line to buy a Genesis, driven by a primal fear that their children would be left behind in the great digital race. It was a fascinating display of keeping up with the Joneses, only the Joneses had just upgraded to a machine that could render a 360-degree loop-de-loop without breaking a sweat. Sega had successfully convinced the world that power was the only thing that mattered. They turned a toy into a technological imperative. It was a masterpiece of universal spiderweb marketing, linking everyone's desire for status to a black plastic box that played games about a fast rodent. The final score. As 1989 drew to a close, the 16-bit war was just beginning. Nintendo would eventually strike back with their own super system, and the bit inflation would continue until we reached numbers so large they ceased to have any meaning at all. But the legacy of 1989 was the birth of the console rivalry. It taught us that we must take sides. You are either a Nintendo person or a Sega person. You either value the sturdy plumber or the fast hedgehog. It was the beginning of the digital tribes, a world where we define ourselves by the brands we consume and the bits we defend. As for me, I'll stick to my one-bit lifestyle. A single solid thought is usually enough for a day's work, and I don't need blast processing to enjoy a sunset or a well-turned phrase. But I will admit, there is something impressive about that blue hedgehog. If I could move that fast, I might actually be able to finish my autobiography before the next century starts. Then again, if I moved that fast, I'd probably miss all the good jokes. And in 1989, the jokes were the only thing that were truly worth the blast. Chapter 14. The Little Mermaid Song. I have often observed that the human race is never quite satisfied with its current biological arrangement. A man with a fine head of hair wishes he were taller. A tall man wishes he had the nimble feet of a dancer. And, if the year 1989 is any indication, a fish with a perfectly functional tail will spend an entire afternoon singing about her desperate desire to possess a pair of legs. For many years, the Walt Disney Company, that great American fable factory, had been languishing in a state of creative bankruptcy that reminded me of a steamboat with a cracked boiler and a captain who had lost his spectacles. They were churning out films about misunderstood foxes and brave little toasters, while the public looked on with the polite, glazed expression of a man watching a lecture on the history of the turnip. But in November of 1989, they released The Little Mermaid, and in doing so, they discovered a secret as old as the Mississippi. If you want to sell a story to the masses, you don't just tell it. You set it to a Broadway beat and make sure the villain has the best wardrobe in the production. The House of Mouse gets a makeover. Before Ariel swam onto the screen, Disney was a bit like an old aunt's parlor, full of dusty lace, smelling of mothballs, and desperately in need of a fresh coat of paint. They had forgotten that their greatest strength was not in cartoons, but in musical theater disguised as ink and paint. Enter a pair of gentlemen named Howard Ashman and Alan Menken. They were men of the theater, and they treated the ocean floor like the stage of the Majestic. They realized that a movie shouldn't just be a series of events. It should be a song and dance extravaganza, where the characters burst into melody the moment their emotions become too large for mere prose. I've seen this before. In the 19th century, we had the operetta, a form of entertainment where a man would be stabbed in the heart and then spend 10 minutes singing a high C about the injustice of it all. Disney simply moved the operetta underwater, replaced the tenors with crustaceans, and waited for the checks to clear. The "I Want" song and the hoarding of junk. The centerpiece of this new era was a little ditty called "Part of Your World." In the theater business, they call this the "I Want" song. It is the moment where the protagonist looks at the audience and explains exactly what is wrong with their life so we can spend the next hour rooting for them to fix it. Ariel's problem, it seems, was that she was a hoarder. She had a cave full of gadgets and gizmos, who's-its and what's-its, and most importantly, thingamabobs. She had 20 of them, in fact. As a man who once tried to patent a self-pasting scrapbook, I can relate to the desire to collect useless inventions. But Ariel's true longing was for the human world. She sang about wanting to walk and run and stay all day in the sun. Now, as someone who has spent a fair amount of time walking through the dusty streets of Missouri, I can tell you that walking is a vastly overrated activity. It involves blisters, mud, and the constant risk of stepping in something left behind by a mule. If I had a tail that allowed me to glide through the water without ever having to worry about a corn or a bunion, I would stay exactly where I was. But such is the human heart, or in this case the fish heart. It always wants the one thing it wasn't designed to have. Crustacean conductor. Then there was Sebastian, a crab with a Jamaican accent who served as the king's advisor and the film's moral compass. I found Sebastian to be the most relatable character in the film. He was a middle manager who was perpetually stressed, overworked, and constantly ignored by a teenager who thought she knew better than the entire ocean. His big number, Under the Sea, was a masterpiece of propaganda. He argued that life on land is a disaster, while life under the waves is a permanent tropical vacation. The seaweed is always greener in somebody else's lake, he sang. It is the most profound philosophical statement of 1989. We are a species defined by our envy. We look at the neighbor's lawn or their 16-bit Genesis, chapter 13, or their lack of a dorsal fin, and we conclude that we have been cheated by the universe. Sebastian tried to tell Ariel that she had it good. No taxes, no jobs, and plenty of hot crustacean bands. But Ariel wasn't listening. She was too busy staring at a fork, which she called a dingle hopper, and dreaming of the day she could use it to brush her hair. The businesswoman of the abyss. Every story needs a villain, and in Ursula the Sea Witch, Disney gave us a masterpiece of administrative malice. Ursula was not a monster who wanted to eat the protagonist. She was a contract lawyer. She offered Ariel a deal: 3 days as a human in exchange for her voice. It was a classic TwAInian swindle. She didn't use force. She used information management. Chapter 2. She presented a scroll that was about 6 miles long, filled with fine print and whereas clauses, and asked a love-struck 16-year-old to sign it without reading the footnotes. I've seen many men lose their shirts in similar deals involving silver mines or riverboat insurance. Ursula understood that the most powerful thing in the world isn't a magic trident, it's a binding agreement. She was the cold fusion, chapter 9, of the ocean, promising a miracle while hiding the fact that the cost would be your very soul, or at least your vocal cords. The absurdity of the transformation. The climax of the film involves Ariel actually getting her legs, and this, my friends, is where the hilarious history truly begins. We are meant to find it romantic that she trades her ability to sing, the very thing that defined her, for a pair of appendages that she doesn't even know how to use. She spends the rest of the movie stumbling around like a newborn colt on a frozen pond, unable to speak, trying to convince a prince to kiss her. It is a terrifying commentary on the dating habits of the late 20th century. We believe that if we just change our physical appearance enough and keep our mouths shut, someone of high social standing will eventually fall in love with us. In the original tale by Hans Christian Andersen, the story ends with the mermaid turning into sea foam because the prince marries someone else. It is a grim Scandinavian tragedy that teaches children that life is hard and then you dissolve. But Disney, being an American corporation, decided that sea foam was bad for the universal spiderweb marketing. They gave us a happy ending, where the girl gets the guy, the dad gives up his power, and everyone lives happily ever after in a castle by the sea. The Disney Renaissance. Despite my cynicism, I must admit that The Little Mermaid saved the Walt Disney Company. It launched the Disney Renaissance, a decade-long stretch where they produced a series of hits that turned animation back into a prestige art form. They proved that even in an age of Batmania, Chapter 6, and Seinfeld, or Chapter 7, people still crave a bit of magic, even if that magic involves a singing crab and a very questionable legal contract. We want to believe in a world where the little fish can win, and where love is stronger than a 6-mile-long scroll of fine print. As I look back at 1989, I see Ariel as the perfect symbol for the year. Like the people in Berlin, Chapter 11, she wanted to cross a border. Like the students in Tiananmen, Chapter 5, she was rebelling against an old, stubborn authority. And like everyone else in 1989, she was convinced that the future was just one song and dance number away. A pilot's final note on fish. Personally, I still think legs are a design flaw. They require shoes, which require polishing. They require trousers, which require ironing. And they have a distressing habit of giving out just when you've reached the top of a long flight of stairs. But if a fish wants to trade her voice for the privilege of standing in a grocery line or walking through a muddy street, who am I to judge? We are all trying to be something we aren't. We are all mermaids dreaming of the shore, or humans dreaming of the stars. Chapter 8. The song of 1989 was the song of the transition. We were moving from the old world of 19th century traditions into the new world of digital dreams and neon musicals. And if we had to lose our voices a little bit along the way to get there, well, at least the soundtrack was catchy. Now, if you'll excuse me, I believe I have a dingle hopper that needs to be used for its intended purpose, which is, of course, eating a very large piece of pie. Chapter 15. The End of the Afghan Winter. I have observed, through a lifetime of watching men march off to various corners of the globe with shiny buttons and even shinier intentions, that empire is a very expensive hobby. It is much like owning a giant temperamental elephant. It looks magnificent in a parade, but the cost of feeding it is astronomical, and it has a distressing habit of stepping on your own feet when you aren't looking. In February of 1989, the Soviet Union, that vast gray collective of information managers, Chapter 2, who believed that the entire world could be run like a very grim post office, finally decided that their decade-long holiday in Afghanistan had reached its natural exhausted conclusion. They packed up their tanks, their heavy coats, and their battered pride, and they crossed the bridge of friendship back into their own territory. It was the end of what some called the Soviet Vietnam, but I prefer to call it the Great Himalayan Misunderstanding. It was a moment that proved once again that history is a book where the chapters on invading the mountains are always written in the same ink, the kind that fades the moment the wind picks up. The invitation that wasn't. To understand the Afghan winter, one must understand the peculiar nature of the Soviet mind in the late 1970s. They believed that history was a train on a fixed track, and they were the conductors. When the tracks seemed to wobble in Afghanistan, they decided to send in a few divisions of advisors to straighten the rails. Now, advisor is one of those marvelous bureaucratic words like dispersant, Chapter 3, or subscription, Chapter 13. That sounds helpful, but usually involves a great deal of shouting and the occasional explosion. By the time 1989 rolled around, those advisors had been there for 10 years, and they had discovered that Afghanistan is not a train station. It is a vertical maze of rock, dust, and people who have spent the last 3,000 years perfecting the art of being entirely ungovernable. I have spent some time in the mountains. I know that a mountain is not a territory. It is an attitude. You cannot conquer a mountain any more than you can conquer the weather. You can stand on top of it for a while, and you can plant a flag, but eventually your feet get cold, your supplies run out, and the mountain is still there, looking down at you with a cold, stony indifference. The mujahideen and the magic wands. The Soviets were fighting an enemy called the mujahideen, a group of warriors who possessed the home field advantage and a very long memory. For years, the Soviets had the upper hand because they had helicopters. There is nothing quite as intimidating to a man on a horse as a flying tank that can rain fire from the clouds. But then, the universal spiderweb, Chapter 2, of international politics intervened. The Americans, in a fit of the enemy of my enemy is my business partner, began supplying the mujahideen with a device called the Stinger missile. I find the Stinger to be a fascinating piece of technology. It is essentially a magic wand for the common man. You point it at a multi-million-dollar Soviet helicopter, you pull a trigger, and the helicopter ceases to be a weapon of war and becomes a very expensive piece of scrap metal. It was the Game Boy, Chapter 4, of the battlefield, portable, battery-powered, and capable of ending a high-stakes game in a matter of seconds. Once the Soviets lost the sky, they realized they were just men in heavy boots trying to chase ghosts through a labyrinth of caves. They were the Exxon Valdez, Chapter 3, of land warfare, a giant clanking machine that had run aground on a reef of geography and was now leaking its lifeblood into the sand. Gorbachev's Great Yard Sale. By 1989, the Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev, a man who possessed a birthmark on his head that looked remarkably like a map of a country he was accidentally dismantling, realized that the Afghan war was a bleeding wound. Gorbachev was the Seinfeld, Chapter 7, of the Kremlin. He looked at the vast, expensive drama of the Cold War and asked, "What's the deal with all these tanks? Why are we spending all our money on missiles when our people can't find a decent loaf of bread?" He decided it was time to perestroika, restructure the empire, which is a polite way of saying he was holding a giant going-out-of-business sale. The withdrawal from Afghanistan was the first item to be cleared out of the warehouse. On February 15, 1989, Lieutenant General Boris Gromov was the last Soviet soldier to walk across the bridge into what was then the USSR. He didn't look back. I've seen that look before. It's the look of a riverboat pilot who has finally navigated a treacherous stretch of water and just wants to find a dry bed and a quiet drink. The Graveyard of Empires. Afghanistan has earned the title of the Graveyard of Empires. It is a place where grand ambitions go to die and be buried under 5 feet of snow and 2,000 years of tradition. Alexander the Great tried it. The British tried it. 3 times because the British are famously slow to take a hint. And the Soviets tried it. The lesson is always the same. You can buy the valley, but you can't own the people in it. An empire is built on the idea that order is something you can export. But Afghanistan proves that order is a local product. It doesn't travel well. It's like a delicate cheese. It might be wonderful in Moscow or London, but by the time it reaches the Hindu Kush, it's just a stinking mess that no one wants to eat. A man who carries a cat by the tail learns something that can be learned in no other way. An empire that carries Afghanistan by the tail learns the same thing. Only the cat is larger and the scratches are deeper. The irony of the exit. The hilarious part of the 1989 withdrawal, if you have a sufficiently dark sense of humor, is what happened next. The Soviets left behind a country filled with weapons, mines, and a generation of warriors who had just defeated a superpower. The universal spiderweb had done its job. The Soviets were humbled. The sledgehammer of history, Chapter 11, was swinging toward the Berlin Wall, and the Americans felt very smug about their magic wands. But they forgot that once the war is over, the warriors don't just disappear. They stay in the mountains, and they keep their stingers. We spent the rest of 1989 celebrating the end of the Cold War and the Velvet Revolution, Chapter 12. But we ignored the fact that the Afghan winter hadn't actually ended. It had just changed management. We were so busy watching The Little Mermaid, Chapter 14, and playing Tetris that we didn't notice the fire we had helped start was still smoldering in the mountains. A pilot's perspective on retreat. As a man who has had to back water on more than one occasion to avoid a collision, I have a certain respect for a graceful retreat. There is no shame in realizing you're in over your head and heading for deeper water. But the Soviet withdrawal wasn't a graceful retreat. It was a confession. It was the admission that the old guard, Chapter 1, was bankrupt. Not just financially, but ideologically. They couldn't even manage a show about nothing in their own backyard, let alone a global revolution. As the last tank rolled across the bridge, the 19th century dream of territorial conquest died a quiet, cold death. The future was going to be about information, Chapter 2, consumerism, Chapter 6, and 16-bit processing, Chapter 13. The era of the big map was over. The era of the small screen had begun. The mountains of Afghanistan remained, of course. They didn't care about Gorbachev. They didn't care about the Stinger missiles, And they certainly didn't care about the universal spiderweb. They just waited for the next empire to show up with a parade and a pocketful of shiny intentions. And if history is any guide, they won't have to wait very long. Chapter 16, The GPS Constellation. I have always maintained that the most essential piece of equipment for any traveler is not a sturdy pair of boots, a reliable compass, or even a well-stocked flask of medicinal brandy. It is the ability to be profoundly and comfortably lost. To be lost is to be alive. It is the moment when the map becomes a useless piece of paper and the world becomes a place of genuine discovery. I spent years on the Mississippi learning the shape of the river, a shape that changed with every sandbar and every fallen cottonwood. We had to know the water by feel, by the smell of the mud, and by the peculiar way the moonlight hit a ripple. If we had known exactly where we were every second of the day, we wouldn't have been pilots. We would have been clerks on a very damp commute. But in February of 1989, the United States Air Force decided that the era of the wandering soul was a luxury the modern world could no longer afford. They launched the first of the Block 2 GPS satellites from Cape Canaveral, and in doing so, they began weaving a celestial net that would eventually ensure that no human being would ever have the pleasure of not knowing where the devil they were. The mechanical stars of the Air Force. Now, the concept of global positioning is not entirely new. Sailors have been looking at the stars for centuries, though the stars are notoriously unhelpful when the clouds move in, or when you've had enough rum to see 3 or 4 versions of the North Star. The clever fellows in Washington decided that since the natural stars were too unreliable for the business of modern warfare and the delivery of pizza, they would simply build their own. They called this the Navstar system. The plan was to launch 24 satellites into a constellation around the Earth. I find the term constellation to be a bit of a stretch. To me, a constellation is something romantic, like Orion or the Big Dipper. This was more like a global fleet of tattletales. These satellites are not just drifting around up there like cosmic dust. They are orbiting at about 12,000 miles above the Earth, moving at speeds that would make a 16-bit hedgehog, Chapter 13, look like he was standing in cement. They are equipped with atomic clocks, devices so precise that they lose only 1 second every few million years. I have a pocket watch that loses 5 minutes every time I sneeze, so the idea of a clock that accurate strikes me as a form of technological arrogance. The geometry of the tattletale. To tell you where you are, these satellites use a process called trilateration. It is a fancy mathematical way of saying that if you know how far you are from 3 different points, you can figure out exactly where you're standing, provided you haven't moved since the math started. The satellite sends out a signal at the speed of light, which is about 186,282 miles per second. Your receiver on the ground, which in 1989 was the size of a suitcase and cost more than a mid-sized farm, catches that signal and calculates the time it took to arrive. If we want to get technical, and I generally don't, unless there's a wager involved, the distance, d, is calculated by the time difference between the signal being sent, t sub s, and received, t sub r. d equals c, times open parenthesis, t sub r minus t sub s, close parenthesis, where c represents the speed of light. By doing this with 4 satellites, The fourth one is there to make sure your clock isn't lying to you. The system can pinpoint your location on the surface of this wet marble with the accuracy of a few feet. It is a masterpiece of information management. Chapter 2. We have turned the entire planet into a giant invisible graph paper, and we are the dots. The death of the shortcut. What does this mean for the human spirit? It means the end of the scenic detour. In my day, if you took a wrong turn at a crossroads in Tennessee, you might end up discovering a hidden valley, a charming little town with a questionable reputation, or at the very least, a brand of moonshine you'd never sampled before. You were forced to interact with the geography. You had to stop and ask a local for directions, which usually involved a 20-minute conversation about the local hog prices and the health of the man's grandmother. But with the GPS constellation, the geography is irrelevant. You aren't in Tennessee. You are at latitude 36.1627 degrees north, longitude 86.7816 degrees west. You are a coordinate. The machine doesn't care about the view. It only cares about the shortest distance between 2 points. I suspect that within a generation, the human brain will begin to atrophy in the navigation department. We will become a race of people who can't find our own kitchens without a satellite link. We are trading our internal compass, that mysterious, beautiful instinct that tells a man which way the river flows, for a glowing screen that tells us to turn left in 500 feet. The electronic leash. There's also the matter of privacy. In 1989, the GPS system was still largely a military toy. The selective availability feature meant that the Air Force purposefully fuzzed the signal for civilians so they wouldn't use it to accidentally fly a private plane into the Pentagon. But even then, the writing was on the wall, or rather, the signal was in the sky. We were building a world where it is impossible to disappear. I've spent a lifetime trying to avoid creditors, editors, and overly enthusiastic fans. The beauty of the 19th century was that if you didn't want to be found, you simply moved 3 counties over and changed your hat. But in the era of the GPS, the universal spiderweb now has eyes in the heavens. We are putting an electronic leash on the entire species. I've seen the way people look at their gadgets. They don't look up at the stars anymore. They look down at the little gray screen, Chapter 4, to see where the satellite thinks they are. We have moved the high ground from the mountaintop to the orbit, and we've given the keys to the men in the Pentagon. The pilot's lament. As a pilot, I find the whole thing a bit insulting. The joy of piloting was in the uncertainty. You had to read the river. You had to watch for the breaks and the sets. You were engaged in a constant high-stakes chess match with the water. If I had possessed a GPS on the Paul Jones, I wouldn't have learned anything. I would have just followed a line on a screen. I would have been a passenger in my own life. God created the world in 6 days, and on the 7th day, He rested. But if he'd had a GPS, he probably would have finished by Thursday and spent the weekend wondering why he felt so unfulfilled. The Block 2 satellite launch in 1989 was the first step toward a world where the unknown is an endangered species. We are mapping every square inch of the planet, from the black tide of Alaska, Chapter 3, to the graveyard of empires, Chapter 15. We are leaving no stone unturned and no coordinate untracked. The irony of the constellation. The year 1989 was a year of walls falling, Chapter 11, and empires crumbling, Chapter 12. We were celebrating our newfound freedom, and yet, at the very same moment, we were launching a system that would eventually allow a company in California to know exactly which grocery store you're standing in and how long you spent looking at the pickles. We are a funny lot, aren't we? We tear down the Iron Curtain and replace it with a silicon net. We cheer for the tank man of Chapter 5 for standing his ground, and then we buy a device that ensures we never have to stand our ground because we'll always know the quickest way to run away. As I look up at the night sky, I don't see the ancient gods or the romantic heroes anymore. I see the 24 mechanical tattletales, blinking their atomic clock signals down at us, keeping us on the path, keeping us on time, and keeping us from ever being truly lost. I'll stay here on the riverbank, thank you very much. I may not know my exact longitude, and my latitude is a matter of some debate among my neighbors, but at least I know where I am. I'm right here, in the present, and I don't need a satellite to tell me that the view is spectacular. Chapter 17. The Romanian Christmas. I have always been of the opinion that if a man insists on being a dictator, he ought to at least have the common decency to be a colorful one. If you are going to oppress a nation, the least you can do is provide a bit of theater, a few plumes, a dash of eccentric jewelry, or perhaps a penchant for riding a white horse through the lobby of the National Bank. But the dictators of the late 20th century, particularly those residing in the drab neighborhood of the Iron Curtain, were a distressingly gray lot. They dressed like funeral directors, spoke with the rhythmic charm of a metronome, and possessed the collective imagination of a damp brick. However, in December of 1989, my centuries occasionally blur like a cheap ink blot, Nicolae Ceausescu of Romania decided to break the mold. He didn't do it through wit or charisma. He did it by being so spectacularly out of touch with reality that he turned a national tragedy into a dark, Christmas-themed farce. He was a man who had spent 24 years convinced that he was the genius of the Carpathians, only to discover on a Tuesday afternoon that the Carpathians, and everyone living on them, had decided his particular brand of genius was a commodity they could no longer afford to stockpile. The Palace of the Paranoid. To understand the Romanian Christmas, one must first look at the house the Ceausescus built. Nicolae and his wife, Elena, decided they needed a home that reflected their standing in the universe, which they estimated to be somewhere just slightly above the Archangel Gabriel. They called it the People's House, which is a marvelous piece of administrative deception. If you name a building the People's House, you can justify tearing down 5 square miles of historical neighborhoods and displacing 40,000 people to build it, because, theoretically, it belongs to them. It is much like a man stealing your cow and then inviting you over to admire the quality of his new leather boots. The building is a sprawling marble-clad monstrosity, the second largest administrative structure in the world, surpassed only by the American Pentagon. It contains 1,000 rooms, enough marble to pave the moon, and gold-plated faucets that I suspect were never intended to touch the hands of an actual person who worked for a living. It was a monument to a kind of gilded age of communism, while the people were standing in line for 4 hours in the freezing sleet to buy a single suspicious-looking cabbage. Nikolai was wandering through his marble halls, wondering if the velvet curtains were sufficiently majestic to muffle the sound of his own growing irrelevance. I have seen this kind of palace fever before. It is the disease of the man who stops listening to the street and starts listening only to the echo of his own boots on the parquet floor. Nikolai and Elena lived in a private world of their own making, a web where they were the only spiders and everyone else was merely a fly whose sole purpose was to applaud on cue. The Scientist and the Swindle. Elena Ceausescu was a particular delight to my cynical soul. She was styled as a world-renowned scientist and the mother of the nation. Her academic credentials were about as authentic as a wooden nickel, but she insisted that her name be placed on every scientific paper published in Romania, regardless of whether it concerned the properties of polymers or the mating habits of the common garden slug. I've met many experts in my time, men who claimed they could find water with a willow branch or cure a fever with a magnet, but Elena was the ultimate patent medicine salesman. She was a woman of limited literacy who expected the world to bow to her towering intellect. It proves a point I've often made. If you tell a lie loud enough and execute anyone who points out the grammar mistakes, people will eventually stop correcting you and start writing your biography. She was the alchemist of the abyss, turning the nation's common sense into a leaden weight of state-mandated flattery. The balcony of the bewildered. The end began on December 21st. Nikolai, sensing that the sledgehammers of history were getting a bit too close for comfort, decided to hold a massive rally in Bucharest. He wanted to show the world, and those prying television cameras of the universal spiderweb, that the people still loved him with a fervor bordering on the divine. He stood on the balcony of the Central Committee building, looking down at a crowd of 100,000 people who had been bussed in, handed "I Heart Nikolai" signs, and told to cheer as if their lives depended on it, which at the time they quite literally did. He began his speech, his voice droning on about the achievements of socialism and the glorious future that awaited them, when something unprecedented happened. Someone in the crowd booed. I wish I could have seen Nikolai's face in that moment. It was a moment of profound comedic silence. For 24 years, the only sound he had heard from a crowd was a rhythmic, mechanical applause. Now there was a low, guttural hiss. The genius stopped. He blinked. He looked like a man who had just realized his trousers were missing in the middle of a formal dinner. He held up his hand, a feeble gesture that said, "Hush," as if he were a schoolmarm dealing with a rowdy classroom rather than a dictator facing a revolution. There is no sight quite as pathetic as a God who has just realized his worshippers are currently looking for a sturdy rope and a tall tree. He tried to bribe them right there on the spot, promising to raise the minimum wage by a few hundred lei. It was like trying to stop a forest fire with a water pistol. The crowd wasn't interested in a raise. They were interested in a change of management. The rally turned into a riot, and the genius of the Carpathians retreated inside his palace to discover that the locks were no longer responding to his command. The helicopter of hasty retreats. By the next morning, the army had decided that they were no longer in the business of protecting marble faucets for a man who was afraid of a boo. They joined the protesters. Nikolai and Elena, realizing that the velvet revolutions happening elsewhere were turning into something much more like grit and iron in Romania, fled to the roof of the Central Committee building and climbed into a helicopter. It was the most crowded flight in the history of aviation. There were the Ceausescus, 2 bodyguards, and 2 advisors, all crammed into a space designed for a small family of sensible weight. They took off, hovering over a city that was currently burning their portraits and dancing in the streets. They didn't get far. The pilot, perhaps realizing that his passengers' credit was no longer good at any bank in Europe, told them the army was going to shoot them down and landed the helicopter in a field. The mother of the nation and the genius of the Carpathians were reduced to hitchhiking. They were eventually picked up by a policeman who drove them to a local military garrison, which promptly turned into their prison. The shortest show on earth. The trial took place on Christmas Day. It was not what you would call a fair and balanced judicial proceeding. It lasted about 90 minutes, which is roughly the time it takes to watch a mediocre play or wait for a slow lunch. There were no masked millionaires to save them, and no high-speed digital processing could alter the inevitable conclusion. The prosecutor accused them of genocide, subverting the national economy, and, most importantly, being generally unpleasant people to live with for a quarter of a century. Nikolai refused to recognize the court, insisting he was still the president. Elena shouted at the guards, telling them they were ungrateful children and that she had been like a mother to them, to which the guards likely thought that if this was motherhood, they'd much prefer to be orphans. It was a domestic squabble played out on the stage of world history. At 2:45 in the afternoon, they were found guilty and sentenced to death. They were led out into a courtyard, and before the television cameras could even get into position to film the event for posterity, a group of paratroopers, who had reportedly volunteered for the job with an eagerness usually reserved for a long-lost relative, opened fire. A dark Christmas present. The footage of the execution was broadcast on Romanian television that evening. It was a Christmas special, unlike any other. For the people of Romania, it was a moment of profound catharsis. They had spent their lives in the shadow of the palace, and now the owners were gone. But as a man who has seen many new eras begin with a bang, I felt a familiar twinge of skepticism. You can kill the dictator, but you can't easily kill the palace problem. Romania woke up on December 26th with the same empty shelves, the same crumbling infrastructure, and a new government made up of many of the same people who had served Nikolai until the moment the first boo was heard. The Romanian Christmas was a reminder that when a leader stops listening to the street eventually comes through the front door. It was a violent, sudden end to a decade that had tried so hard to be velvet and digital. I looked at the photos of the People's House and thought of my own Mississippi. A river doesn't build palaces. It doesn't ask for applause. It just moves. If you try to dam it up or tell it where to go, it will eventually rise up and sweep your marble faucets into the Gulf of Mexico. The Ceausescus tried to dam the human spirit with concrete and gold-plated lies. They forgot that even the most elaborate web can be torn down by a single, honest voice. 1989 was the year the walls fell, and in Romania, the wall fell right on top of the people who built it. Now the people just had to figure out how to fix the plumbing. Chapter 18. The Malta Summit. I have long believed that the only way to get two men to agree on anything is to put them on a boat in the middle of a storm. When the floor is tilting at a 45-degree angle and the chandelier is threatening to become a permanent part of your cranium. Your interest in ideological purity tends to give way to a much more pressing interest in the location of the nearest life jacket and the stability of your last meal. In December of 1989, the world's two most powerful information managers, George H.W. Bush and Mikhail Gorbachev, decided to meet in Malta to discuss the fate of the human race. It was a meeting designed to officially put the Cold War into the archives and let the dust settle on 40 years of global tension. But nature, which has a very low tolerance for human pomposity, decided to cast its own vote. Nature sent a gale. Nature sent waves the size of apartment buildings, and in doing so, nature turned the most important diplomatic event of the decade into the C6 summit. The two captains and the floating parlors. The setting was Marseilles Bay, a place that is usually a very pleasant Mediterranean postcard, but on this particular weekend looked like a laundry machine set to agitate. The Americans arrived on the USS Belknap, a guided missile cruiser that looked like a very expensive gray chisel. The Soviets arrived on the SS Maxim Gorky, a cruise ship that had been converted into a floating diplomatic parlor. I find this choice of vessels to be a perfect metaphor for the two nations. The Americans brought a weapon, and the Soviets brought a place to sit down and have a drink. Now, as a man who has spent a fair portion of his life on the water, I can tell you that a ship in a storm is a very democratic place. It doesn't care if you have 5,000 nuclear warheads, or if you have a birthmark that looks like a map of a country you're accidentally dismantling. When the Maxim Gorky began to pitch and roll, the international proletariat and the leader of the free world were both reduced to the same basic human condition, clutching the arms of their chairs and praying for the sweet, stationary embrace of a parking lot. The diplomacy of the Dramamine. President Bush, a man who possessed the quiet, prudent demeanor of a New England librarian, was forced to stay on the Belknap while the storm raged. The waves were so high that the small boats, the tenders, couldn't ferry him over to the Soviet ship. He was marooned on his own cruiser, just a few hundred yards from the man he was supposed to be befriending. I've seen many diplomatic stalls in my time, usually involving disagreements over the shape of a table or the protocol of who sits where, but this was the first time in history a world summit was delayed because the superpowers were afraid they'd fall into the ocean. When they finally did meet, they looked like two men who had just survived a week in a rotating barrel. They were exhausted, they were pale, and they were finally ready to talk. I suspect that the end of the Cold War wasn't caused by a sudden realization of the brotherhood of man. It was caused by the fact that both sides were too tired and too nauseous to keep up the pretense of wanting to destroy each other. The two exhausted boxers. For 44 years, the world had been a boxing ring. In one corner, you had the capitalists who believed that the goal of life was to own as many electronic gadgets as possible. In the other corner, you had the communists who believed that the goal of life was to stand in a line for 5 hours to buy a shoe that didn't fit. By December of 1989, the fight had gone into the 12th round. Both boxers were bleeding, both were broke, and both were looking at the referee with a desperate plea for the bell to ring. Gorbachev was the boxer whose trainer had run off with the water bucket. His empire was crumbling. His neighbors were leaving the building through the Velvet Revolution, and his Romanian cousin had just been forcibly retired in a most permanent fashion. He needed the fight to end so he could go home and figure out how to pay the rent. Bush was the boxer who had won on points, but was currently suffering from a massive headache caused by environmental disasters and the sheer cost of keeping the lights on in the gymnasium. They sat down in the wood-paneled lounge of the Maxim Gorky and essentially agreed that the war was a draw in the sense that everyone was sick of it. Bush promised not to jump on the wall and gloat, and Gorbachev promised to stop pretending that the Soviet Union was anything other than a giant bankrupt estate sale. The logic of the leveler. The probability of peace in Malta wasn't calculated in a laboratory, it was calculated by the stomach. When you combine the economic collapse of the East, the exhaustion of debt in the West, and the sheer force of a Mediterranean storm, the result is inevitable. The Cold War didn't end because we found a magic solution. It ended because the leaders realized that the information they were managing was mostly just a list of things they could no longer afford to keep. The handshake heard round the bay. At the end of the summit, they held a joint press conference. This was a novelty in itself. Usually, the two leaders would meet, glare at each other from across a wide room, and then release separate statements accusing the other of being a threat to global stability. But in Malta, they stood side by side. Gorbachev declared that the world was leaving one epoch and entering another. Bush, in his characteristically understated way, said he looked forward to a lasting peace. I've heard politicians talk about lasting peace before. It's usually a term used right before someone launches a new conflict or invades a mountain range. But this time, it felt different. It felt like the old guard was truly vacating the premises. They weren't shaking hands out of love. They were leaning on each other so they wouldn't fall over. It was the most honest moment in the history of the 20th century. The irony of the post-war world. Of course, the hilarious part of the Malta summit is what the world thought would happen next. People actually believed that once the Cold War ended, we would enter a peace dividend era. We thought we'd take all the money we spent on missiles and spend it on televisions and better snacks. We forgot that the human race is like a river. If you remove one snag, the current just finds another one to pile up against. We were ending the big war, only to make room for 1,000 little ones. We were tearing down the Iron Curtain, only to realize that the people behind it had a lot of ancient grievances and a very large supply of leftover weaponry. The Malta Summit was the happy ending of the 1980s. It was the moment the world found its legs. But, as I've noted, legs are a complicated business. Once you have them, you have to decide where to walk. And the world of 1989 was about to find out that walking into the 1990s was going to be a lot harder than just sitting on a boat and feeling seasick. A pilot's final word on the gale. I sat on the deck of my imagination and watched those two ships disappear into the mist. I felt a certain sympathy for those two men. They had tried to manage the world, and the world had responded by throwing a gale at them. It proves my point. You can have all the blast processing and atomic clocks you want, but you are still just a passenger on a very small, very wet rock. The Cold War ended not because of a grand strategy, but because the actors were tired of the play and the weather was terrible. As for me, I'll take a storm on a river over a summit on a sea any day. On a river, you at least know which way the bank is. In Malta, the superpowers discovered that the only thing more terrifying than being enemies was the prospect of having to be friends in a world that no longer had a script. The bell had rung, the boxers had stopped swinging, and for the first time in 40 years, the world was quiet enough to hear the sound of the digital age beginning to hum in the dark. Chapter 19. The Neon Retrospective. I have often thought that a decade is much like a house guest who arrives with far too much luggage, drinks all your best bourbon, tells the same 3 jokes for 10 years, and then disappears into the night, leaving you with a stained carpet and a lingering sense of profound bewilderment. As the clock ticks toward the final midnight of 1989, I find myself sitting on the porch of the Universal Spiderweb, looking back at the 10-year fever dream we call the 1980s. It was a decade that began with a cowboy in the White House and ended with a playwright in the Prague Castle. In between, humanity managed to invent the Game Boy, spill enough oil to lubricate a continent, and convince itself that wearing neon pink leg warmers was a sign of a sophisticated civilization. If the 19th century was the age of steam and the early 20th was the age of steel, then the 1980s was undoubtedly the age of aerosol. The great atmospheric hair crisis. One cannot discuss the 1980s without addressing the hair. I have seen some impressive topiary in my time. Hedges in England trimmed to look like sitting ducks, and French gardens that required a degree in geometry to navigate. But nothing compares to the structural engineering performed by the youth of the 1980s upon their own heads. The goal, it seemed, was to defy gravity through the liberal application of chemical resins. We created a big hair culture that required an amount of hairspray so vast it actually bored a hole in the ozone layer. Think of the irony. We were so concerned with looking fabulous for a Friday night dance that we nearly dissolved the very shield that protects the planet from being toasted by the sun. I've always said that man is the only animal that will risk global extinction for the sake of a hairstyle that makes him look like he's been startled by a ghost while standing in a wind tunnel. Then there was the shoulder pad, another sartorial mystery of the era. For 10 years, women, and an alarming number of men, walked around looking like they were perpetually prepared to play linebacker for the Chicago Bears. We were a decade of power dressing, a term that suggests if you make your shoulders wide enough, the world will eventually mistake you for someone who knows what they're doing. We spent the decade trying to look physically larger than we were, perhaps to match the size of the debts we were accruing. It was a time when a person's silhouette was more a matter of upholstery than anatomy. The Gilded Age versus the Greed Decade. As a man who lived through the original Gilded Age, I felt a certain sense of déjà vu during the 1980s. In my day, the robber barons built railroads and steel mills. They dealt in tangible things like coal, iron, and the sweat of men. In the 1980s, the new barons, the yuppies, built mountains of paper debt and used information management to move money that didn't actually exist. The motto of the decade was famously, "Greed is good." It was a sentiment that would have made even a Mississippi riverboat gambler blush. We traded the old work ethic for a new wealth ethic. We became obsessed with the brand. A shirt was no longer a piece of cotton designed to keep the wind off your back. It was a status symbol that required a specific animal to be embroidered over your heart. If you didn't have a horse or a crocodile on your chest, you were essentially invisible to polite society. Status in the 1880s was a private rail car. Status in the 1980s was a mobile telephone the size of a masonry brick and a car that talked back to you in a polite robotic voice. We replaced the brass bands in the park with synthesizers in dark rooms, and we replaced the monopolist in the top hat with the insider trader in neon suspenders. While the old monopolists build things that lasted, the new ones seemed intent on building things that could be sold off in pieces before the bank realized the vault was empty. The philosophy remained the same, however. Get it all and get it now, and if you can't get it, borrow enough to pretend you did. The digital crawl and the floppy dream. Technologically, the 1980s was the decade where the universal spiderweb began to twitch in its sleep. We moved from the typewriter, a machine that required a certain amount of physical violence to operate, to the personal computer. I recall seeing a Commodore 64. It was a beige box that hummed with the quiet confidence of a machine that knew it was about to change the world, even if it could currently only display 16 colors, and took 20 minutes to load a game about a jumping frog. We were fascinated by the floppy disk, a piece of plastic that was neither particularly floppy nor capable of holding more than a few pages of text. We were in love with the idea of the future. We watched movies about cyberpunks and digital worlds, convinced that by the year 2000, we would all be living inside a computer, wearing silver jumpsuits, and eating our meals in pill form. We didn't realize that the future was actually going to be a lot more mundane, mostly consisting of waiting for a satellite in the sky to tell us where the nearest sandwich shop is located. We traded the ink-stained fingers of the 19th century for the floppy dreams of the 20th, and we haven't looked back since. We became a race that worships the glowing screen, believing that if we can just process enough data, we might eventually find a way to avoid having to think for ourselves. The neon aesthetic. Why was everything neon? I've spent many nights pondering this. In the 19th century, our colors were mud, soot, and faded rose. They were the colors of the earth and the industry that pulled things from it. The 1980s, however, decided that if a color didn't make your eyeballs ache, it wasn't worth looking at. We painted our world in teal, magenta, and electric lime. It was a visual representation of the decade's energy, loud, artificial, and perpetually on. We were living in a music video. Everything was backlit by a pink sunset and featured a man playing a saxophone on a rooftop for no apparent reason. It was a 10-year performance piece, and the audience was too busy doing aerobics in spandex to notice that the set was starting to wobble. We lived in a world of artifice, where the show about nothing was often more real than the nightly news, and where we preferred the neon glow of a bar to the natural light of a moonrise, the shattered walls, and the morning after. As the decade drew to a close, the party took a sudden serious turn. The sledgehammers of history finally swung. The Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia and the violent end of the Romanian palace proved that while you can distract a people with Batmania and 16-bit video games for a while, you cannot feed them on neon alone. The 1980s was a decade of profound contradiction. We were more connected than ever before through our new digital gadgets, yet we were obsessed with the me. We were wealthier than ever on paper, yet we were haunted by the black tides of oil and the cold winters of mountain wars. We were standing on the edge of a new millennium, looking back at the ruins of the old one and wondering if we'd packed enough batteries for the trip into the unknown. I suspect that history will judge the 1980s as a sort of puberty of the modern era. It was a time of awkward growth, terrible fashion choices, and a desperate desire to be seen as an adult while still wanting to play with toys. The relationship between the volume of our hairspray, the height of our shoulder pads, and the rate of our greed was such that common sense was often squeezed out entirely. When common sense is treated as a luxury rather than a necessity, the fever dream grows to fill the vacuum. Waking up. As the 1980s prepares to hand over the keys to the 1990s, I feel a strange sense of relief. The neon is fading, the hair is finally losing its structural integrity, and the Cold War has been put into the closet along with the Rubik's Cubes and the Cabbage Patch Kids. The 1980s was a magnificent, hilarious, heartbreaking mess. It was the decade where we learned that walls can fall, that computers can be friends, and that a mermaid with legs is a recipe for a very expensive musical. We are waking up from the fever dream, blinking in the light of a new decade, and wondering where we left our shoes. It was a hell of a party, I reckon. I wouldn't have missed it for the world, but I'm certainly glad I don't have to clean up the confetti. The sun is setting on the 80s, and for the first time in a long time, the horizon doesn't look pink and teal. It just looks like the future. Chapter 20. The Midnight of the Millennium. I have observed that the human race is the only species on this planet that finds it necessary to gather in large, shivering herds in the middle of a winter night to watch a glowing ball slide down a flagpole. We are a people obsessed with the countdown. We act as if the arrival of a new digit on the calendar is a profound cosmic event, rather than merely a mathematical convenience we invented to keep track of when the rent is due. If a dog were to watch us standing in Times Square on December 31st, 1989, it would conclude that we had all suffered a collective brain fever and were waiting for a giant, luminous egg to hatch. But here we were, at the edge of the 1990s. The air in New York smelled of roasted chestnuts, exhaust fumes, and the desperate electric anticipation of a million souls who were quite certain that the future was about to arrive in a tuxedo. For my part, I sat on the metaphorical railing of history, smoking a digital cigar and wondering why, after a century of progress, we were still so fascinated by the simple tug of gravity. The mechanics of the descent. The ball in Times Square is a masterpiece of public theater. It is a 6-foot sphere of aluminum and electric lights, designed to drop 77 feet in exactly 60 seconds. To the physicist, it is a simple matter of potential energy becoming kinetic. To the crowd, it is the hand of God turning the page of a very long and messy book. I find the movement of the matter to be the only part of the evening that makes any sense. The ball is tethered. It is a controlled descent, measured and precise. It serves as a perfect metaphor for the human condition in 1989. We are falling headlong toward the 21st century, but we have rigged the ropes and pulleys to make sure we don't hit the ground too hard. We want the thrill of the fall without the inconvenience of the sudden stop at the bottom. The crowd below was a sea of neon retrospection. They wore plastic glasses in the shape of the number 1990, which I found to be a particularly cruel form of ocular torture. Imagine trying to look through the zeros of a new decade while your toes are slowly turning into ice cubes. They blew tin whistles and hugged total strangers, fueled by the delusion that once the clock struck 12, their debts would vanish, their digital wars would end, and the universal spiderweb would finally provide them with a decent reason to exist. The pundits and the crystal ball. I have spent some time reading the newspapers of the day, that old-fashioned information management of the printed word. The pundits of 1989 were busy making grand predictions for the 1990s. They spoke of the paperless office, though I suspect we will simply invent more ways to print things we don't need to read. They spoke of the end of history, as if history were a train that had finally reached its station. I, however, know that history is a river. It doesn't end, it just gets muddier, deeper, and more prone to flooding your basement when you least expect it. The experts seem to think that the fall of the Berlin Wall meant that humanity had finally graduated from the school of hard knocks and was ready for a quiet retirement in a suburban paradise. They promised us global peace and a dividend from the end of the Cold War. They even suggested we might have flying cars by the end of the next 10 years. I, however, suspect we will simply have cars that sit in traffic more efficiently while we distract ourselves with small gray screens. They predicted a digital utopia, a place where every mind is connected. I see that same utopia and worry it will merely be a place where every village idiot is connected to every other village idiot by a high-speed cable, allowing nonsense to travel at the speed of light. The rising digital tide. As the seconds ticked away, I realized that 1989 was the last year of the real world. For thousands of years, if you wanted to talk to a man, you had to see his face or wait for the mail. If you wanted to see a picture of a distant planet like Neptune, you had to be a scientist with a telescope and a great deal of patience. But the universal spiderweb was no longer just a proposal in a laboratory. It was growing. It was the water currently rising around our boots. In the 1990s, we would stop being citizens and start being users. We were about to trade the solid, muddy banks of the Mississippi for the flickering, neon-lit currents of the information superhighway. I worry for the pilots of the next century. In my day, you learned the river by hitting the snags and feeling the current against the hull. In the digital future, there are no snags, only links. You can travel 1,000 miles without ever feeling the spray of the water or the bite of the wind. We are becoming a race of passengers, comfortably seated in our pocket-sized frontiers, watching the world go by through a glass-bottomed boat made of silicon. We are gaining the world's information, but I wonder if we are losing the world's flavor. The century of the child. I looked down at the younger members of the crowd, the ones who had grown up with singing mermaids and masked millionaires. They are the first generation to believe that a miracle is something you buy in a plastic box and power with a battery. To them, the cold fusion of the past wasn't a tragedy. It was just a failed product launch. They are the heirs to the sledgehammers that broke the walls. They will be the ones to navigate the velvet transitions of the future. I hope they have kept their keys from the revolutions in Prague, because they are going to need them to unlock the complexities of a world where everything is connected, but nothing is anchored. We have spent the 20th century learning how to move our bodies across the globe. We will spend the 21st century learning how to keep our minds from being scattered to the four winds by the very machines we built to help us think. The final 10 seconds. The countdown began. 10, 9, 8. The roar of the crowd was a physical force, a vibration in the air that reminded me of a steamboat's whistle right before it pulls away from the dock. It was the sound of hope, that most dangerous and beautiful of human delusions. At 5, I thought of the man with the shopping bags in Beijing and wondered where he was sleeping tonight. At 3, I thought of the black tide in Alaska and the fact that nature always keeps a record of our mistakes. At 1, the ball reached the bottom of its journey. The sky exploded. 1,000,000 tons of confetti, essentially the paperless office in its final festive form, rained down upon the heads of the believers. The year 1989 was gone. It was no longer history. It was yesterday. The midnight toast. I raised my digital glass to the 1990s. I didn't toast to progress or peace or prosperity. I toasted to resilience. The year 1989 taught us that walls can fall, that ground can shake, and that even the most absolute dictators can be brought down by a single, honest boo from a crowd that has had enough. It taught us that we are a ridiculous, petty, magnificent species that will stop in the middle of a revolution to check the batteries in our toys. We are entering a new decade, the midnight of the millennium. We are 10 years away from a date that has haunted the human imagination for 1,000 years. We are standing on the deck of a ship that is moving faster than any riverboat ever could, heading into a fog that no satellite in the sky can fully penetrate. But as the fireworks faded and the crowd began to drift away, looking for their lost shoes and their misplaced socks, I felt a strange sense of peace. The river is still flowing. The sun will still rise over the mountains and the spiderwebs alike. The 1980s were a fever dream, and 1989 was the climax. We have woken up. We have our legs. Now we just have to see if we can remember how to walk without tripping over the wires. Happy New Year, world. Try not to break anything important in the next 10 years. I'll be here, watching from the bank, keeping the information managed and the wit dry. Onward into the 90s. I hear there's something called a website being built, and I suspect I'm going to have a few choice words to say about it.